Welcome back to the 4th annual season projections for the Dynasty League. I'm your host, Commissioner, and reigning champion, Joe Packer, and I'm here to take you through what's sure to be another absolutely incredible Dynasty year. You know how this goes, there's only 10 teams, so I gotta predict somebody to come in last, and unfortunately this time, it's gonna be the New York Gems. It might really suck for Anthony to hear that he's predicted for last after relocating to New York for a fresh start, trading away franchise cornerstone Joel Embiid, and nabbing a couple of highly touted prospects in the DBL draft, but is there really anyone else worth considering? If you look around the league, there's not one other team committed to a rebuild, as the 9 competitors remaining all believe they have a chance at contending, and the fucked up thing is that for the most part, I could see a universe where every other team is contending, or at the very least making the playoffs, so it's not exactly an insult to predict the Gems for last, especially since Anthony should know the repercussions of retooling his focus away from Embiid, but when I look at all the other teams in the DBL, the Gems are the only team I can confidently say aren't fighting for postseason success. Last year was another year in the now former N. Jameson's organization where they seemed to finish higher than they had any right to. Anthony willed his team to an impressive 500 record at 9-9-1. Yes, he finished in the lottery at 8th place, but he was one win removed from a second consecutive playoff berth. The reason I'm amazed Ant's team performed so well is pretty simple. His roster left a lot to be desired. Other than Trae Young and Joel Embiid, the Gems hoarded Paul George on their IR all year long and only had one other bright spot in Rookie of the Year winner Scotty Barnes. The rest of the roster is made up of inconsistent role players and fringe fantasy contributors, along with the storied production of Joel Embiid that was sent packing for Maryland with a month left of the season. To say this team overperformed is putting it lightly, especially in a league where so many other teams seem to have stacked rosters across the board. However, what helps Anthony year in and year out is his dedication and willingness to try even when things go sour. He's always paying attention and giving 100%, which helps him do better than some teams which might actually be better. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening this season since in my estimation, every other team is far and away more equipped with talent. It all starts with your keeper, since every year when you finalize the 8 guys you want to move forward with, you're essentially saying, this is the core of my team and who I'm going to draft, build, and strategize around. Other than Trae Young and Scotty Barnes, I have to give a big thumbs down to the rest of Ant's core. Now that should make a little bit of sense since he is hypothetically rebuilding, but you can still have a handful of enticing pieces heading into a renovation. But when it comes to the Gems, I don't have high hopes for any other keeper here. Yes, Trae and Scotty are great, but when we move over to Paul George, some of those puzzling directions and confused feelings of identity that plagued Anthony's team over the last few years come right back to the forefront. PG is a great player, but there's a number of questions we have to ask. For starters, can he stay healthy? Because over his last 3 seasons with the Clippers, the answer is no. Not only that, but can he get back to that OKC level of dominance? Because in my opinion, he's been on the fantasy decline ever since he got to LA. Lastly, why would Anthony even keep him if he's rebuilding? Now, Ant doesn't have his pick in next year's draft, and I would never tell anyone to straight up tank in the first place, but this should be a season where the Gems analyze and observe all the young potential they possibly can. It should be like a tryout year for people that he wants to bring back the following season, or when he truly feels he can contend again. Paul George is 32 years old, and an old 32 at that with his recent injury history. Going into the offseason, my number one priority as the GM of the Gems would have been getting Paul George off my fucking team. That might sound harsh because, again, he's a proven player that could even have a bounce-back season and wind up as like a top 10 fantasy asset by year's end, but he doesn't belong on the Gems in a situation where they might wind up with their lowest win total in franchise history. And PG is my favorite keeper outside of Trae and Scotty, so you know I have some more ranting and rambling to do. Up next is Kristaps Porzingis, who I think at this point could legitimately not be moved for a second round pick. I traded 2 firsts and Lauri Markkanen for him 2 years ago, and it was an overpay then. We know the story of KP at this point. He's a borderline DBL all-star when he actually gets on the court, but he's never even had time to improve his game and get better throughout the years because he's constantly sidelined due to some kind of injury. And it's not his fault, but at some point he's practically unrosterable. I don't necessarily blame Anthony for keeping him, but all I can do is hope and pray that Porzingis manages to play 50 games because even that would be a miracle. I thank the heavens when I shipped him off last season, and I'm so grateful I did because he once again missed a majority of the season, and the same thing will happen this year. Now, Keldon Johnson, on the other hand, is not a bad keeper, but he's still a bottom of the roster and a bench kind of guy to hold on to. He definitely has a chance to turn his game up another notch with DeJounte Murray out of San Antonio, but Ant kept him for the same reason last year when DeMar DeRozan left town, and he really should have shown some kind of improvement with a player of the same position clearing up minutes for him, even with DeJounte's uptick in scoring. It's definitely possible Keldon finally breaks out the way we've been waiting for him to over the past 3 years, but I also wouldn't at all be shocked if he didn't, considering his output last year. Alas, this is still one of the better players that the Gems secured for Season 4. And when it comes to JJJ, I've simply never been a believer of this guy. Even when I drafted him in our initial Dynasty draft, I fed into the hype surrounding him that I didn't necessarily see myself. And I'm not saying I know everything, because I certainly don't. I'm just saying I should have stuck to my gut because my opinion of him has just gotten worse over the years. He can't rebound 4 seasons into his career, so I don't see that changing. He can't stay healthy 4 seasons into his career, and his 5th season is also going to start on the sideline for a couple of months, and he has never averaged higher than 20 fantasy points 4 seasons into his career either. Now, I know he's still very young, and 4 years is not quite that much time, but I think it's enough of a sample size to get a certain taste of what to expect out of him for the long run. He can certainly improve, and he's flashed that lethal upside with his monstrous blocking efforts, but to be a big man in our league and not be a double-double threat makes him almost useless, and he's even more useless when you remember he doesn't play in half of the games he's supposed to. Sticking with the theme of another injury-prone big man, we really have no idea how good James Wiseman is or is gonna be. He basically hasn't played in the NBA for 2 years straight, and we only saw a handful of games as a rookie. And on the Warriors with their deep rotation, I'm not sure how much he even plays to begin with, but he still has a frightening level of potential to unlock. I'd just be very scared about his health going forward. I don't blame Ant for keeping him since he's young and could be very special, but as of right now, I wouldn't want James Wiseman taking up a roster spot on my team, especially as a part of my core. So, saying I'm not a big fan of all the keepers I just criticized is an understatement, but none of them are head-scratchingly puzzling or unequivocal disasters. That is, until we get to the final piece of Ant's core, his 8th keeper, Andrew Christian Wiggins. To me, Wiggins qualifies as a weekly waiver wire pickup in our league, but the fact that he's 28 and is clearly never going to develop his game past the point it's already at will make him a bad keeper on any team in the DBL, never mind one that's promoting a youth movement. Wiggins is a champion, he played fantastic in the postseason, and is a more than respectable NBA role player, but this is not the NBA, and Wiggins averaged under 18 fantasy points last year. If he was a second or third year player, that'd be acceptable, but as I stated, he is an NBA veteran. He's not changing. What you see is what you get. He has now cemented his role in the NBA landscape, and with the bevy of young pieces the Warriors have like Poole, Kuminga, and even Moody, his playtime may even fluctuate downwards. There's nothing enticing about owning Wiggins in fantasy, let alone even drafting him. Let me play a clip from last year's video when Ant did just that. However, at least these guys are both young and fit the rebuild road. Anthony's next pick at number 11 was Andrew Wiggins, who isn't young and has certainly peaked at this point in his career. He's not getting any better than 19 fantasy points per game, and I would have imagined the Jamesons would have wanted to snag some younger talent or rookies rather than Andrew Wiggins' dumbass, especially with the first pick in the second round. He'll have some above average games here and there, but I've personally just been done with Wiggins in fantasy for years, and I stand by that. And that was me being nice about taking Andrew Wiggins. Yes, he was selected to an all-star game, but we all know it was undeserved as his stats mimicked the prior year's numbers, and in fact, they actually went down. I guess Ant is hopeful that Wiggs' playoff performance will carry into the regular season, but that is a giant fucking leap of faith to take, especially when Cole Anthony and Tyler Hero are literally younger and better, and they were cut to make room for the Maple Jordan. However, other than Wiggins, I don't flat out hate the decisions to retain a lot of these players, since Anthony is supposedly rebuilding. Most of them are pretty young and have showcased the potential to make something of themselves, but I still don't really like them, and as of now, with the talent and competitiveness the DBL has to offer, I don't think this core comes close to matching up with anyone else's. Sliding over to Ant's draft, I was incredibly shocked by his decision not to take Chet Holmgren. It really seemed like the perfect scenario since the Gems are a young team and are clearly not built for winning at all this year. I can't say I blame him for passing on him. I mean, I did the same thing, so I totally get it, but the difference is that I am expected to go to the finals again. I'm not in rebuild mode. I mean, for Ant's sake, it really felt like a no-brainer, and I do think he will regret this, especially if he comes in last place like I expect. That's not to say he didn't pick up a couple of juicy ballers, just as the second overall pick, Keegan Murray. I like Keegers a lot. I feel like his game is going to translate to the NBA very quickly, and he does in fact have star potential, but his situation may cap his value for at least this season. The Kings have playoff aspirations, and even if they likely don't make the postseason, Fox and Sabonis are the 1 and 2 guaranteed. That might help Murray be more efficient than the typical rookie, but I don't necessarily envision gaudy stat lines. Is he better than Chet this year? Obviously. Is he better than Jabari? That remains to be seen, but at least Jabari's in a little bit more of a friendly fantasy situation right now. Regardless, Keegan Murray should be really good in years to come and certainly has the potential to average 21 fantasy points in his debut season alone. With the 4th overall pick, Ant selected Tyrese Maxey, and what can I say? This is a great pick. I considered him myself. I mean, he's got a lot of upside and it's already been tapped into. I'm not sure how much further of a step he takes again this year, but considering his age and the Gems timeline, Anthony definitely made the right choice. Well, if Chet wasn't available, but moving over to his 3rd pick in the first round, Ant selected Jaden Ivey. While there's a ton of potential and I do like his odds going forward, I don't believe he's going to be all that good this year. Score-first guards or wings typically struggle pretty mightily in their inaugural seasons, such as Trae Young, Jalen Suggs, Anthony Edwards, Jalen Green. I mean, the list goes on. He has the benefit of Cade taking a lot of that pressure off of him, but I do see him having a lot of cold stretches throughout the year. Like Jalen Green and Anthony Edwards, I think he'll start to heat up after the All-Star break, but I imagine he'll be largely inconsistent for most of the season. That's the risk we all take when we take rookies, but at least Anthony's in a position where he has all the time in the world to develop him. After those first round picks though, I'm not a huge fan of these other selections. Ant took Obi Toppin at 37, and while I really like him, I just don't trust the Knicks, man. Until he's proven to get playtime, it's just a wasted selection at this point. Again, this pick makes more sense than it would for literally any other team, and if Ant's willing to put the time into his projects, then they may really pay off, such as pick 44 in Isaiah Jackson. Not a bad idea, but again, there's a playtime issue. Jalen Smith is starting at the 4, and Miles Turner is still somehow in Indiana. Until he finally gets traded, Jackson's minutes are limited, but I like the idea since Turner is always out of the lineup with injury, and Jackson would be the prime candidate to take over. Lastly, Ant chose Ayo Dosunmu, who also showed a lot of potential, and with Lonzo still out, there's opportunity for him to take another leap forward. The Bulls still have a bit of a clogged rotation at the guard spots, and if Zoe does return, he's probably going to be worthless, but as of now, this isn't a bad pick for late into the 5th round. Overall, Ant's draft is actually pretty encouraging, and they all fit the mold of his apparent rebuild. I'm not completely sold on a handful of them, but the other half I do like, and can definitely be worthy additions down the line, and even this year. Although the Gems had a solid draft, I'm still not enamored with most of their keepers and decisions. Anthony traded away Joel Embiid, a top 3 fantasy player at the deadline last year, going on record to say that he was rebuilding and blowing it up. But other than that franchise-altering move, there hasn't actually been much of a rebuild taking place. From my point of view, it just feels like Anthony got rid of one of the best players in the league and then stopped dead in his tracks. Yeah, having 3 picks in the first round where it's highly likely at least 2 of them pan out this season is going to be helpful, but a rebuild is more than just trading away your organization's untouchable centerpiece. Cam's rebuild was unprecedentedly fast, and I think a lot of people are forgetting that he had to go through a year of shit and an all dumbass selection to get to where he's at now. You can't rush greatness, and if you want to be great, you need to have a lot of patience and a more clear-cut long-term goal. Ant seemed to display an overconfident belief in his team making the playoffs, but all signs indicated that he was going to be in tank mode. I just don't see a viable way he's playing meaningful postseason basketball with all the talent in the league this year. If I were the Gems, I'd strongly consider trading Paul George for someone's first next year, because who knows, that could be Victor fucking Wembanyama. But I wouldn't stop there. I'm cleaning house on the quote-unquote older guys like Porzingis and Wiggins as soon as possible. As for now, with all the injury-prone players, unproven guys, and undistinguishable identity of the organization, I have to project Ant for last with a best-case scenario coming in the form of 8th place. As I stated at the beginning of this video, every other team excluding the Gems has a legitimate shot to make the playoffs in my mind, so narrowing the rest of these rankings down and picking 3 more teams to miss the postseason is excruciatingly difficult, but since somebody has to fall in line next, my prediction for 9th place this year is none other than Big Smoke with a 6-13 record. Last year, Sam got the bronze medal as he finished in 3rd with a 10-9 performance. I've got to be honest, I was pretty shocked by the final outcome, considering how his previous season unfolded and based on other teams in the league that I believe to be superior simply finishing lower. Sam's biggest accomplishment last year was playing an outstanding managerial role when his team needed him the most in the semifinals. Although I wound up winning by over 200 points, 6 out of 7 days in that matchup were pure hell for me as Sam made all the right moves and paid critical attention to the waiver wire. I was very impressed with that performance in the most dire time of the year, but everything else that comes before that matters too, and honestly, if Sam had given his team that effort all season long, we might have had a different champion. Now, I'm not trying to harp on it, and I'm not inherently pointing out these things I'm about to say to make Sam feel bad. I'm just like a media pundit ranking actual NBA teams and reflecting on their performances over the past couple of seasons. The Western Conference was a mess last year for a number of reasons we'll get into at various points throughout the video, but Smoke could have easily been the number 1 seed had he not lost the 2 or 3 matchups he lost from not setting his lineup. And it might be a tired criticism, but historically, factually, over 3 seasons now, Sam has lost matchups that pivoted the standings and prevented him from either making the playoffs or accomplishing more. I know this because if you go back and do the math, Big Smoke actually wins them, moving his placement in the standings into 1st, where he would have had a week 1 bye and likely would have made the finals. Now, as I say every year, people forget to set their lineups at times, but when it happens this much, it is legitimately costing you a chance at a title. Say we went back in time and all Sam did differently was set his lineup. There may be an entirely different outcome on the season. That's just from doing what is essentially required of you as a manager. Now say Sam picked up more guys throughout the year, adjusted his IR when necessary, paid illustrious attention to the game like he did in the playoffs, and made trades or moves that improved his team. I feel like we'd have an unquestioned contender, if not champion. Trades are not required, especially when a lot of people, including myself, send some bogus offers, but I can tell you right now, for as long as I'm a contender, I'm making a move at the deadline to have an even greater chance of winning. If your opponents do that and you don't, then there's a huge chance you'll fall behind, as we've actually seen come to fruition with the likes of James against Josh in the 2021 finals. So I'm saying all this to say, the fact that Sam still finished in 3rd and came this close to a championship with some of those issues is pretty imposing. However, that window of time I talked about Sam having to win a championship with his elite fantasy talent over the past 3 years may have finally closed. The blinds might not be shut and that window could still be pried open, but as far as I'm concerned, Sam is now operating within the space of a crack, and not the kind of crack that he'd enjoy. While Sam's keepers are once again his typical crop of elite players, I think they're all worth discussing to some extent. LeBron just averaged 30 points per game at 37 years old, so I have no concerns with his actual performance, but almost every year in LA has been an injury-riddled campaign for LeBron, and he's only going to be another year older on top of the mileage and heavy responsibilities he's shouldered the past few years. He'll be a DBL All-Star again, no question, but will that make up for the amount of games that he'll likely miss? Curry is also a year older at 34, and while he just won a championship and his first ever Finals MVP, can he maintain a healthy regular season after the past 2 to 3 years has showed us otherwise? And even more concerning, will his game start to decline in the DBL? Because last season, he dropped from 32 fantasy points to 28 fantasy points. That's still very good and not an enormous fall off or anything, but what if I told you Nikola Vucevic had the same drop off and also averaged 28 fantasy points? All of a sudden, it seems kinda worse. I'm just saying, these guys are older, their bodies aren't holding up as well anymore, and Curry might even start to decline a bit with his fantasy production. Now, in my opinion, Sam's best keeper and most important asset is easily SGA. He seems like a superstar waiting to happen, and he only just turned 24. The only issue I have with him is that he seems to be a very injury-prone player at this point. He's had season-ending injuries both of the past 2 years, although that is probably just the Thunder shutting him down so they could tank, but it still seems like a valid concern to have at this stage in the game since he's starting this season on the sideline as well. Moving over to DeJounte Murray, though, I'm a fucking moron because I didn't believe in him anymore heading into last year, and he was arguably a top 5 fantasy player. He averaged 35 goddamn fantasy points, but now he's on the Hawks, playing alongside the All-NBA talent of Trae Young, and even in the scenario that Murray is still freakishly good, you have to assume that number is going down. I think he'll still put up around 18, 7, and 7, but, Westbrook just did literally that, and the entire world hates him. I'm not saying he's going to be as inefficient or turnover-prone as Russ, but there's a chance his production could drop by almost 10 whole fantasy points. Ingram is also a very good player, but I do think he's a bit overrated as a fantasy asset considering he's never eclipsed 25 fantasy points, and that was in his first year in New Orleans. Still, he's a more than solid keeper who remains steady and consistent and could still improve. Now, I already touched on Westbrook, but if I was Sam, like Anthony with Paul George, the first thing I would have done this offseason is get Westbrook off my goddamn roster. He was still a DBL All-Star last season at 24.5 fantasy points, but like my prediction with DeJounte Murray for this season, Westbrook dropped not 10 fantasy points in production, but nearly 20 from the year prior. If he's on a team isolated from ball-dominant players, he will be a top 2 fantasy asset, but it didn't work with LeBron and Davis, and if it's actually going to, his role is going to diminish even further. I would have shipped him out for whatever little value he had left, because although there's still a chance he's an elite fantasy player in LA, the clock is ticking as he declines in play and grows in age. This is the championship window I was talking about that is now just barely cracked open. Maybe there's a hole in the screen or a hammer to break the goddamn glass, but with the way some of these guys are looking, it's not shaping up to be another shot at contention. Still, most of Sam's keepers are above average and supremely talented while not without some red flags. However, his last two are really not doing him any other favors. Malcolm Brogdon has been an impressive 23 fantasy point plus contributor the past few years, but that's also come with nagging injury issues to the point that even with as good as he was, I wanted nothing to do with him. There's players we all just kind of check off or strike out on our heads, and he was one of them for me. Now you put him in Boston as a potential sixth man with other fantasy producers other than Miles Turner, and this guy is averaging 19 fantasy points at best, and realistically I see him falling somewhere between 17 and 18. He even went on record to say, "I'm done stat padding, I just want to win." I could be wildly wrong, but even if I am, he's still going to play like a third of the games this year. He's just not keeper worthy anymore, which makes that championship window once again seem even tighter. Throw in his final player being Ivica Zubac, and you've got some underwhelming keepers with a lot to prove this season. Zubac could be sneakily good, but I feel like he's someone you take a flyer on in the second round of the draft, maybe even third. There were better players available on other teams, and assuming Sam is trying to win it all, he definitely should have tried to get 2 more keepers to replace Brogdon and Zubac. Unfortunately, I'm also under the impression that Sam's keepers were the best component of the general makeup of his roster heading into the season. His offseason clearly didn't make a difference, and in my opinion, his draft isn't really going to either. I like Anthony Simons, but I'm not nearly as high on him as most, and I definitely wouldn't have taken him in the first round. He was fantastic with Lillard out of the lineup, but can he be that CJ McCollum type player next to Dame, with Jeremy Grant, Josh Hart, Yusuf Nurkic, and others taking up touches? We have yet to see Simons' game translate with all of these guys, and especially Lillard, so I'm remaining cautious, although I do think there's certainly potential for him to break out. Still, him breaking out might only be 19 to 20 fantasy points at the end of the day, and his career trajectory might only make him as good of a fantasy player as someone like Terry Rozier. At 14, Sam chose OG Anunoby, which is his second best pick after Simons, but I don't really like it. OG is fine, he's serviceable, but I think the days of waiting for him to be much more of an impactful offensive player are over. For the literal 5th option in the starting unit, he's pretty damn good, and I like him, but as a fantasy player to be taken in the lottery when he's obviously not a focal point of the Raptors' go-to stars, I'm not big on this selection. Next is Sicko Mode, and I understand why Sam took him because there was a time period last season when Mo Bamba was scarily good and finally took that next step forward, but just like rotation issues plagued his whole career prior, they will once again. Paulo Banchero, Franz Wagner, Wendell Carter Jr., and Chuma Okeke are all expected to play forward minutes for this Magic squad, and that's not including the possible return of Jonathan Isaac or all the other mouths to feed on offense such as Cole Anthony, Markelle Fultz, Jalen Suggs, Terrence Ross, and RJ Hampton. I'm guilty of taking a Magic player myself, so I fall into a similar boat, but WCG is CGJ. Well, let's get that out of the way. WCJ, no disrespect to the former Knight. He's clearly the better player of the two, and it's not like Bamba's starting at PF over Banchero, so I think Bamba's fantasy outlook on the season is pretty much capped. Then Thomas Bryant and Darius Bazley were Sam's last two picks, and I don't like these guys. I feel like we see them go in the draft every season and nothing ever comes of them. I think if Bazley couldn't be fantasy relevant in the last two seasons on such a bad Thunder team, then it's never going to happen, and Bryant won't be getting a lot of minutes, but I guess when AD gets hurt, there's a chance he's effective, but it's not probable. To me, Sam's draft is not going to push the needle for a team that I already think is in trouble based on everything I previously said. His keepers obviously have their strong points and great contributors, but a lot of them are old, injury-prone, or just straight up not good. Incorporate that with Sam's reluctance to improve his team through trades during the offseason and most of the year, his track record of missed lineup maneuvers, and what I'd call a pretty mid-draft. I'm fairly confident Big Smoke will be a lottery team this season, but hey, maybe that means it's time to finally rebuild and secure Victor Wembanyama. Coming in at 8th place is once again another team that I really struggled placing here, but when I factored in everything, it just seemed like the Peach Creek Oofmagoos were going to be out for the count. Gio has had a bit of an up and down fantasy resume since our league initiated, becoming the dumbass of the year in Season 1 and winning Most Improved the following year with what seemed to be one of the better futures in the DBL. But in Season 3, the Magoos took another step back and missed the playoffs, starting their year 0-5-1. However, Gio ultimately bounced back, winning 8 of his last 13 and just barely missing out on the postseason. It wasn't a very eventful year as Gio had a lousy draft that saw him drop every player he selected, and his eye for the waiver wire didn't result in many key pickups, but Gio finally started to show signs of a manager that can make notable trades if he puts his mind to it. His offseason began last year with a package for Clint Capella that didn't really pan out, but I think you have to admire the gusto to go for it. Like, Gio tried to make his team better, and honestly, it did. It was just an overpay considering Capella's decline. Then at the tail end of the year, the Magoos were able to nab Draymond and fucking Kyrie for 1 third-rounder each. That's impressive, but Gio was still distanced from competing for a title, and unfortunately, I think he's going to have a very similar campaign in Season 4. I look at his keepers and immediately think he's poised for a top 5 finish, but with another underwhelming draft under his belt and some inadequate decisions made so far, I've got the Magoos missing the postseason for the 3rd time. For the most part, these keepers are immaculate, but there's still some concerns to be had with a few of them. Tatum and LaMelo are no-brainers and the foundation of the Magoos, so nothing else to say there, except I will actually just point out that as I'm recording this, the news broke about LaMelo injuring, his ankle and going to miss the start of the season. Hopefully it's not a long time, but that does make me feel a little bit more comfortable about the ranking having Gio at 8, because I can't express to you how hard it was to accurately project all of these teams, and especially this middle pack portion. Like, it's been difficult as hell. Obviously, you don't want to see an injury like that to LaMelo, to a star player, to anyone, so prayers out to the Magoos and the Ball family. However, Kevin Durant was clearly the huge acquisition for Gio, and he really didn't have to give up that much to acquire him. The only problem I have with him is that he is on the older side now, and he has had injury-related issues the past 3 to 4 seasons in a row. If I had to assume, he's going to miss some more time again this year, and that's a risk that's probably worth it, because when KD plays, he's a top 5 to 10 fantasy player, so if it's not, a substantial amount of time missed, it's a fantastic problem to have, but considering how Gio filled out his team in the draft, if anyone misses time, it will be a problem. DeAndre Ayton, although still underperforming as an NBA player and never truly reaching elite DBL heights, is still an incredible keeper for his young age at 27 to 29 fantasy points per game. Christian Wood should also continue his impressive play as Luka sets him up some easy buckets on the Mavs. Unless he also finds himself on the injury report once again, C. Wood will be a consistently reliable keeper for Gio, averaging north of 24 fantasy points, and I only have him that low in case coming off the bench lowers his impact a little bit. Either way, that's 5 awesome keepers for the Magoos, but like I said, the tail end of this core is not really up to par. Kyrie is exceptional when he plays, but can we really count on that this season? Like, maybe it's finally the year he suits up for a majority of the schedule, and last year you could argue was an enigma because of the vaccine stance, but even if you take that out, Kyrie is a guaranteed locker room cancer at this point that causes drama everywhere he goes. There's going to be stretches where he doesn't play just because he doesn't feel like it, and then you have to take into his account his injury concerns that have plagued him for a majority of his career as well. Excuse me, had to burp that out. He's a superb basketball talent, but when it comes to having him on your team, I can tell you from experience. The McLovins can tell you from experience. The Stars can tell you from experience. It's not really worth it. He will be magical throughout the year, but he's also going to cause a lot of headaches. And when you have a guy that doesn't care or commit to his NBA team the way a player should, they're in turn not committing to your dynasty team either, and that isn't someone I want in the Knights locker room ever again. That being said, for a goddamn measly third-round pick, yeah, I take him in the locker room. The only thing is that I don't really value him as a keeper, but instead someone I'd rather add to my team to bolster up the roster throughout the season. But either way, a third-rounder isn't going to kill you for the risk. Next is Draymond Green, who is pretty good and arguably better than Kyrie because he's, not just going to be doing whatever he wants, but he is injury prone and another year older. He was an all-star last year and played pretty magnificently before he got hurt, but there is reason to believe he's due for some regression, and again, this is a guy I'd rather draft than cement as a piece of my core, but he should still average somewhere from 22 to 23 fantasy points, although I wouldn't be surprised if that takes a dip too. Lastly is Gio's savior in RJ Barrett. There's nothing more I want than for RJ Barrett to become a superstar, and he's a good NBA player. Not a great one, but he has potential to maybe one day be an all-star. But he averaged 17 fantasy points last year, and only 18 the year before that. I understand he's still young, and when you believe in someone that can develop into a stud, you hold on to them. Like, why do you think I have Josh Giddey? He doesn't really fit with my elite level of talent, but he one day could, and that's a risk I'm willing to take. But the difference is that in Giddey's lone season in the NBA, he was a better fantasy player than RJ's ever been in 3 years. He can still be a very fantasy-relevant player, but other than maybe Anthony, who's somewhat rebuilding, I don't think any other person in the league would take RJ on right now unless they were drafting him and hoping for improvement. To keep him when he hasn't shown that he's a consistent dynasty producer yet is a little extreme, and I didn't think he was worthy of a keeper spot last year either. I was again in a similar boat with Tyler Hero, and I had him for 2 years until I finally cut ties because I realized he wasn't worthy of a keeper spot, so, he hasn't proved it yet. He's got to prove that. He's got better, but he's still not extremely fantasy relevant until he gets his own team or shows that he's legitimately worth it. And for RJ, with Jalen Brunson coming in and Randall still being more of a focal point of the offense, I don't really see his production changing much. If anything, I'd peg him at around 19 fantasy points, but he hasn't even managed to get that high yet either. So while I like RJ as a player, I'm a Knicks fan and he's still young enough to show us he's on the upswing, he's just not a good keeper. I'd like to be proven wrong, but unless he seriously progresses this year, he is just holding back Gio's team from competing at a higher level. Ultimately, Peach Creek certainly has an intimidating core with the likes of KD, Tatum, LaMelo, Ayton, Wood, and of course Kyrie, but when you start peeling back the layers, there's a lot of risk and uncertainty that revolves around this group. And when you break down Gio's selections in the draft, it looks to be another unsuccessful year at capitalizing on filling out his team. Tyler Hero was easily his best choice with the last pick in the lottery, but if he's still coming off the bench and as long as he's relegated to the role that he's in with the Heat, his fantasy output is at 21 fantasy points max. I mean, that's pretty solid actually for the 15th pick, especially with the upside that he has, but he did only average 19 fantasy points last season, so that's why I really don't think Gio swapping a future first rounder for this pick in the draft was worth it. I like Hero, I think he's going to be an all-star sooner than later, but if Gio doesn't hold on to him, this will be a monumental failure. I understand why the Magoo's front office felt like they had to make this move. There's a lot of pressure to win now with their crop of keepers and limited draft compensation, and he wouldn't have been able to pick until the late 4th round without it, but I don't think it's going to necessarily equate. Still, Hero's a respectable decision for when he was taken, and I can't say I blame Gio. But moving on, Lonzo Ball is the complete opposite of that. I mean, yeah, he's also a pretty good player to pick up in the draft at around 21 fantasy points, but he is likely not playing the majority of the schedule or all season. If a guy says, I still can't walk without it hurting, and has been out of the lineup since January or whenever it was that he originally went down, then you are not seeing him play upward of 30 games. I would be shocked if he did, and I'd imagine Gio drops him relatively soon instead of wasting an IR spot on him in the middle of the season when guys start getting hurt or Kyrie decides he doesn't want to play or retire or whatever the fuck. His next pick at 42 is a big gamble in Jaden Hardy, though. I like him, but, I would not have drafted him. I'd be absolutely stunned if he made an immediate impact. He's from the G League and looks promising, so I don't doubt his skill set, but he'll likely be off the Magoos within a few weeks after he gets little playtime or performs wildly inconsistently. See, with guys like this and Lonzo, you're essentially waiting on them to either be available or develop into a solid fantasy player. I don't see why Gio would trade a first rounder for a second rounder to compromise his future if he's still going to bet on projects that diminish his chances at winning now. In the follow-up draft, Peach Creek's final selections were Bagley and Jalen Suggs. We might be in store for Bagley's best season yet, but that could also only mean remaining healthy at 17 fantasy points. I don't hate this pick, but I'm not really expecting him to be reliable. And Suggs, I wouldn't mind for a pick in the follow-up draft if he wasn't injured. He was terrible last year, and for all we know, could have a Darius Garland-like second campaign. But for starters, I don't expect that, and most importantly, he's hurt and we don't know for how long. Not to mention the concerns I already have with the Magic's rotations and players that all want the ball. I'm I'm out on Suggs for the season. At the end of the day, I truly believe 4 out of the 5 players Gio drafted will be off his team by January. There's just not a lot to be excited about with these selections if you're a Peach Creek fan, and that stunts a lot of their opportunity at making the playoffs. I wouldn't be surprised if Gio finished as high as the 5th seed, with how insanely close a lot of these teams in the middle are and how tough it is to project, but I don't think Gio's keepers are enough to get by with all the competition from more balanced rosters week in and week out. I wish the Magoos all the best, but as I mentioned earlier, even some of those keepers worry me. Unless Gio proves to be stellar on the waiver wire early in the season to right some of these wrongs, expect this year to play out similarly to my prediction. And the final team that'll be missing the playoffs this year, in my opinion, is going to be the man, the myth, the legend, Ish. Ish added 2 very good keepers to his core this season, but in my approximation, Ish should have done the complete opposite and blown it the fuck up. Seriously, everyone not named Jokic is out, because the kind of direction Ish has managed his team into the past 3 outings has been none other than a middle-of-the-road first-round exit at best. This year he's made more moves than he's ever done to enhance his roster, but as we take a look at how last season played out and the history of Ish's performance, it's tough to believe this team is going to finish better than any of the 6 others ahead of him. Last year, Ish finished in last place, something that tends to be misremembered considering Gary literally went winless last season. Now clearly it wasn't as awful of a run as the Stars had, but coming in last over a team that went 0-19 is something to be ashamed about. However, in the regular season standings, Ish finished in 9th with an 8-11 record. He was very close to getting another shot at the postseason, and had he actually put in a little more effort, he easily would have made the playoffs again, no question. The problem is that Ish lost a couple of matches because he didn't set his lineup. On top of that, it must have been months where Ish had like Draymond Green and Alex Caruso as IR eligible players and never inserted them into his IR. So he was literally just playing down 2 guys. Like imagine in an actual basketball game, 2 of your guys got injured and instead of putting the bench in, you just rolled with a 3-on-5 lineup for the next month. That's essentially what Ish did, and not to mention with a player like Alex Caruso who shouldn't even be rostered in the first place. So Ish just shot himself in the foot for a majority of the schedule, blindly setting his lineup without even really paying attention to his players, and in some cases not even setting his lineup at all. It's frustrating because you take those very easy to fix problems out, and Ish makes the playoffs as like a top 5 team. And if he were to go the extra mile and make more trades when necessary to bolster up his roster and actually take care of his squad, then when he decides to go for it and compete every year, it would make sense and I can actually get behind that. But since he remains lackadaisical throughout the regular season and doesn't seem to put much effort into actually winning, I maintain the belief that Ish should just blow it up and start over. Jokic is literally the best fantasy player I've ever seen in all my years of playing, and De'Aaron Fox should also be primed for a really big season ahead. In my eyes, it's only a matter of time before he's a DBL All-Star. Ish's next best keepers, in my opinion, are former Knights. DBL Finals MVP Jonas Valanciunas averaged 29-plus fantasy points last year. The only thing that concerns me about him is the return of Zion, but even with Zion cutting into his rebounds and shot attempts, I still see him averaging about 14 and 10. He's going to be a really good fantasy player again, he just might not be quite as effective as he was last season. Still, this was an amazing get for Ish, and so is Nikola Vucevic, a 2-time DBL champion. He also may not be as incredible as he once was, but he'll be averaging around 27 fantasy points as he gets more acclimated with Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan. Would I give up the 3rd overall pick for him? No. And should Ish have? No. But Ish has shown that he doesn't have interest in drafting rookies or unproven players, so if he knows that Vucevic would be one of the best guys available this offseason, then ultimately it's worth it for him. He's still a really good player, and even if he declines a little bit, he's still a keeper-worthy player any contender should wish they have. Julius Randle is also good, but as I started this segment off, if I'm the GM of Team Cabrera, I would have blown it up this offseason and explored the trade market heavily for Randle. He was insatiable 2 years ago, but this past season he dropped by a whopping 7 fantasy points, and for no reason either. It's not like the team added a bunch of guys and his role was cut into, he just started playing like shit. He was still more than serviceable as a fantasy asset, averaging 25 as opposed to 32, but there's definitely reason to be worried with the likes of Jalen Brunson joining the Knicks and a possible breakout year from RJ Barrett. Alas, he should still be a really good keeper. On top of that, Drew Holiday remains with the Cabreras as well, and while he's not the flashiest player and doesn't always have jaw-dropping stat lines, he's consistent if nothing else. That gives Ish 6 above average to phenomenal keepers, not to mention one named Nikola Jokic, who's the 2-time back-to-back MVP. Unfortunately, your keepers don't stop at 6, and Ish is gonna wish that they did, because these final 2 are a couple of the worst keepers selected across the league. Every year, people seem to fall into the Klay Thompson trap because he's a former All-Star and fantastic shooter. It must be that name value that draws people in, because I've said it time and again, Klay just isn't a good fantasy player. In his prime, he averaged like 21 fantasy points. That's what Josh Giddey averaged as a rookie. Klay went for under 18 fantasy points last year, and I understand he was working his way back from a nasty injury, but even if you adjust that into this upcoming season, he's not averaging more than 20 fantasy points, and his best years as a fantasy player, never mind NBA player, are behind him. He is not someone you want to waste a keeper spot on, but every year someone selects him or drafts him when his best role as a fantasy player these days is acting as a waiver wire pickup in a close matchup. The problem is, I don't know if Klay's worse or if it's just final keeper and Karis LeVert is. He averaged barely 17 fantasy points a season prior, and the addition of Donovan Mitchell will almost eradicate him entirely as a fantasy option. Not to mention, he's pretty injury prone and 98% likely to come off the bench. How did Ish not keep Kyle Kuzma over these two? Or even Lowry for that matter, who isn't worthy of a keeper spot himself, but sure as shit makes for a better selection than Clay and Karras. Don't forget Colin Sexton either, who I'm not in love with but still clears Clay and LeVert. Hold on, he also gave me Chris Middleton for nothing too. Replace his last two keepers with Kuzma and Middleton, and Ish might have a list of top 3 keepers in the league, but as of now, he's got a bottom 3 group of keepers, and when you factor in other facets of fantasy that we haven't gotten into yet, it was hard to consider Ish a playoff team. What helps Ish correct his last 2 keepers is what I think is one of the better drafts of the 2023 season. It wasn't an eye-popping draft with top-tier talent, but Ish selected very well for not picking until outside the lottery. At number 18, he picks one of his would-be keepers in Kyle Lowry. Definitely a good pick in my eyes because he can average 21 fantasy points, but it still hurts that he could have kept him and got someone else good here too. The only other flaws with Lowry is he is another year older and missed quite a bit of time last season, but if he could play at least 10 more games and stay consistent, he will be a very useful member of the Cabrera's. Then back-to-back in the third round, Ish went with Lauri Markkanen and John Wall. I don't love Lauri, he hasn't really been good since 2018, but he's playing on a terrible ass team with no offensive options around him aside from Colin Sexton, so he could bounce back to an 18-8 type of season, which would be a great snag for Ish, but again, only if he can stay healthy. The same thing can be said for Jay Wall. Could he easily bounce back to 15 points and 7 to 8 assists? Yes, but is he going to play 65 plus games for only 45 plus? Unfortunately, it's probably closer to 45 plus. That's where Ish's meaningful picks end, so he better pray they all stay healthy, because we sure as fuck know Jonathan Isaac ain't. Even if he returns after all this time, is there any room for him with Paolo and Wagner and all those Orlando pieces? For fantasy purposes, I don't really think so. And his last pick in Kuminga is not terrible. I mean, I have faith Kuminga will be good eventually, but this is a pick for Anthony or a team that has no contending ambitions. This kind of caught me off guard because Ish never drafts young or unproven, like I said, so it's an odd choice, but it was late in the draft with not a lot of talented names left, and who knows, maybe Kuminga will improve and average 18 fantasy points, which would be a steal at this stage in the draft. In the end, Ish had the most purposeful offseason he's ever had and really attempted to make his team better, and I gotta appreciate that. I don't think he would have actually done anything if I hadn't come to him, but he still had to accept those trades, and even if some were overpays, his team did get better because of them. Yet, he still could have done more if he finalized Clay and LeVert as part of his core, and although I like the first 3 picks in his draft, they're pretty much all injury risks. To top it all off, Ish has proven to be more lackadaisical in his managerial approach, as showcased by his efforts in the past. Although I could easily see a universe where he makes the playoffs, I don't think I can trust Ish to lead his team to the postseason until he properly verifies his abilities as a GM. Finally, getting to the first playoff spot where I don't have to feel bad anymore about saying someone's not going to make it, in 6th place, I have none other than the Los Angeles Looney Tunes. As we all know, last year the Tunes had an all-fantasy season where they finished as the best team in the West and made it as far as the 2nd round. That's a monumentally vast improvement over his 1-16 record the prior season, so clearly, CJ was doing something right. So why do I have him barely squeaking in as a borderline playoff team? For as inspiring as LA's progress was last year, there was also quite a bit that went wrong, and in a lot of occasions, CJ found himself on the better side of luck. I'm not saying it wasn't a good season, but there were an equal amount of flaws that held the Tunes back from a possible finals appearance. Although he finished with the Western Conference title, there was a major lapse in the middle of the season where it truthfully looked as if the Tunes were going to be a lottery team for the 3rd year in a row. After starting 4-1, he lost 7 games straight, putting him towards the very bottom of the league standings. And this wasn't by accident, really. I mean, it was clear that at some point during the grueling season, CJ had fallen out of committing to his roster and giving it the attention that it required. I get that other priorities take center stage and can sometimes take us all out of the headspace of fantasy, but that being said, 7 weeks? I'm not saying he wasn't trying that entire time, but it was pretty apparent that at some point he was either forgetting to set his lineup or adjusting it ever so casually, not dropping guys or paying attention to the wire, and just didn't seem to play with that passion that he wound up closing the year out on when he reversed everything and won 7 straight. But it could have been too little too late if Sam actually made those adjustments that I was talking about, or if James' team wasn't absolutely ravaged by injuries. So it was a roller coaster type of season for the organization, and when I look at CJ's core for the upcoming year, I see little improvement in a handful of guys that he's backed. These certainly aren't the worst keepers ever, but when you come off a conference title and plan on contending, a lot of these guys just aren't going to cut it if you want to be one of the best teams in the league. Obviously, that's not true for Giannis, a top 2 fantasy player that CJ finally put some real talent around. Look no further than Karl Anthony Towns, who's going to be very good once again, but I'd like to dive deeper into his trajectory. When you look at what CJ gave up for Towns, it can be argued that he would have finished similarly, if not better, and he would have had a juicier crop of keepers to choose from as well. Towns was excellent last year at over 33 fantasy points a game, but you can make the case case that the Tunes mortgaged their future to obtain him. He's still pretty young and he's a fantastic player, but you put Gobert in Minnesota now, and Towns is probably averaging like 8 rebounds, which is good, and he'll still get a handful of double-doubles, and he should be scoring more efficiently, but I'm just saying, it's something to think about. He didn't even average 10 boards last year with like no one beside him, never mind the fact that I think Edwards is going to overtake Cat as the number one option, so while I still believe Cat will average somewhere in the vicinity of 27 to 28 fantasy points, it's a steep decline from the 34 fantasy points CJ initially traded for. The next big enigma is Zion Williamson, who can make or break the Toon season. He's an unbelievable basketball player, but out of 3 years in the league, he's basically only played one, and I know he was like literally historic at such a young age, but the level of concern regarding Zion is still sky high. I don't know what the fuck happened last year, but it was weird, and if he truly was injured, then I don't see how something like that won't happen again, if not soon. I don't want it to, I'd never wish that, and he's an amazing generational talent, but I don't even really consider him a factor at this point, which I know is absolutely ridiculous, but he's got to prove he can play 50 games first. If he actually does play like 75% of the schedule, then yeah, the league needs to watch out for the Toons, but we need to see if that is actually the case first. Up next is Robert Williams, who might just be my second favorite keeper of CJ's at the moment, which I know is bizarre, but he was exceptional last year in somewhat limited minutes too. He averaged like 27 fantasy points, and he's still super young, so I think he's going to continue to get better. The only issue is that he's going to miss 2 to 3 months to start the season and is building up an injury history that doesn't bode well for his resume. When healthy though, I can see him putting up prime Whiteside level stat lines that actually contribute to his real life team. Next we have CJ McCollum, and I'm admittedly unsure how I feel about him. At the start of last year, and for the past 3 to 4 seasons before that, CJ McCollum was a consistently solid role player for a fantasy team. He's going to give you somewhere from 20 to 22 fantasy points a game. He was always a bit overvalued in fantasy in my mind, with the likes of James selecting him with the 9th overall pick last year, and his play for as long as he was on the Blazers certainly agreed with the idea that he was an overrated fantasy commodity. Then he got hurt, and since he was performing to an even less desirable output of probably like 19 fantasy points a game, James foolishly dropped him for nothing because, I mean, even if he didn't go to New Orleans and play with a rejuvenated purpose, that's still not someone you just want to drop. But in any case, yes, CJ was fantastic on the Pelicans and finished the year averaging 22 fantasy points. I'm just not sure if he's capable of repeating that play, especially when you add Zion into the mix. He's just been like a continuously reliably decent fantasy player for his whole career and never took that next step into improving on his improvement, if that makes sense. So I do think he is one of CJ's better keepers, but for as long as I valued McCollum, he's never been a keeper-worthy player to me, which is exactly why he was available in the draft last year. Next up is Jalen Brunson, who, trust me, as a Knicks fan, I want to be all that and more, but until I see it, I'm unsure his fantasy stock will rise much. He certainly hasn't proved he's worthy of a $100 million contract, but that's a real-world Knicks problem. He's flashed the potential to be a star, he was great in the playoffs, and all things considered, he's a good player. He was honestly probably one of the main supporting catalysts of CJ's success last year, as the Toons nabbed him off the wire to the tune of 19 fantasy points. But I just don't see the production going up by a significant margin, and I'd like to be wrong because, again, I'm a Knicks fan, but you put him in New York with a bunch of other guards and next to RJ and Randall. I mean, is he even the first option? Is he going to expand his game as a playmaker? Is he going to average 20 plus points? If all of those things are a yes, then he could average like 25 fantasy points. But if it's only one of them, I don't see him averaging more than 21 fantasy points, which in my mind isn't enough to take the Toons over the top. Then we move over to Terry Rozier, who is probably the safer pick than Brunson, but doesn't have the higher ceiling. But against my better judgment, Rozier has managed to flourish on the Hornets next to LaMelo and be a pretty decently reliable fantasy player for the past 3 years. At the same time, he only averaged 21.6 fantasy points last season, which is not the kind of production I'm looking for in a keeper, but with Miles Bridges out of the picture, his 19-4-4 from last campaign could turn into like 21-5-5, and if the Toons are lucky, 23 fantasy points per game. But even though Rozier has impressed me by being as serviceable as he has been, I still feel like his time is running out as a fantasy option. Like, it's been too good for too long, because realistically, he's like a Jordan Clarkson type of player that's in a better scenario for fantasy purposes. I can see him being pretty beneficial for the Toons, but he's going to be more inefficient as a second option, and realistically, with as low as I have CJ placed, someone that's going to give you a career high in 22 fantasy points is not someone I'd call a great keeper. Lastly, we have Devin Vassell, which is easily the biggest question mark about CJ's keepers, but I don't really mind the risk. There weren't many other guys for the Toons to choose from, at least in the sense of actual keeper-worthy talent on their roster, and although I would have liked to see LA make moves to acquire stronger names, Vassell's stock has risen with the departure of DeJounte. Now, it seems like him and Keldon will kind of battle it out for who's going to be the primary source of offense on the Spurs, and while there's a possibility they'll both be fantasy relevant, if I had to choose, I would lean towards Vassell, actually. Keldon's been given the opportunity already, and still hasn't really fully broken broken out. Devin flashed some serious upside as a rook last season. Actually, he wasn't a rookie. What am I talking about? It was his second season. Anyway, in the event that DV improves and becomes the first or second option, he will still probably likely only average about 18 to 19 fantasy points, and these high teen, low 20 averages for a considerable amount of the Toons keepers just aren't enough for him to truly compete with the rest of the league's more dominant athletes. I'd applaud a lot of these keepers if this was a rebuilding squad or a team that didn't just make a major move for talent so they could be a win-now organization, but because CJ is now in this position, the depth with this core is not strong enough, even in the likelihood that all of his keepers marginally improved from last season. On the other hand, I do have to give it up to CJ for what I think is a pretty magnificent draft. He didn't select until outside the lottery and wound up with who I think are some pretty great names. At 17, the Toons selected Jalen Smith, which upsets me because I really wanted to take him. He's already been announced as the starting power forward, and we've seen what he's capable of doing when he gets the playtime. Then throw in the possibility of Miles Turner being traded, there's a chance Jalen Smith averages around 18 and 10, which in my mind makes him one of the best players drafted. Next up is Franz Wagner, who I'm shocked wasn't taken either. It's easy to forget how impressive he was in a rookie class that included Scotty Barnes, Cade Cunningham, Evan Mobley, Josh Giddey, and Jalen Green, but he did make all-rookie first team for being one of the Magic's go-to scorers and having the savvy confidence of a 5-year vet. He should be getting better, and obviously he's still at such a young age, but his concern lies in once again the crowded amount of minutes and rotations that will be happening in Orlando. Is Wendell Carter the first option? Is Paolo Banchero the first option? Is Cole Anthony higher in the pecking order? Does Jonathan Isaac return and take up front court minutes? Does Jalen Suggs improve and get a handful of more touches and responsibilities? And where does Markelle Fultz fit into all of this? It's hard to imagine Wagner's fantasy outlook go above the 18-point threshold in my opinion. He could improve as a player but might remain relatively stagnant as a fantasy option. It's an interesting situation to take note of, which is what might have scared the rest of the league away, but he is still someone that could be very special very soon. In the 4th round, CJ grabbed Jared Vanderbilt, who I also like. I'm not sure how relevant he will be since the Jazz have a lot of frontcourt options to try out. Kelly Olynyk, Lauri Markkanen, Udoka Uzabiki, Rudy Gay, Walker Kessler, and Cody Zeller. Obviously, some of those names will be getting little to no minutes, but the only person that I feel like is guaranteed playtime is Markkanen. Vanderbilt was pretty decent last year as a solid pickup in Minnesota, so maybe with less offensive-minded players, he can score and develop more on a horrible Jazz team. At this late in the draft, I like it, I do, but I wouldn't be surprised if his playtime is limited. Moving over to what I think may possibly be the steal of the draft, though, is Terry Eason with the 48th pick, which pisses me off because I was going to take him at 50. I get a feeling about him that I got when I selected Josh Giddey last year, someone that a lot of people are sleeping on and will be instantly fantasy relevant. There's a great chance he doesn't play a full workload, or is consistent enough to be worth rostering in fantasy, but he's been excellent in Summer League and preseason, and the Rockets are a super young team with only the SF position still up in the air. He may be a project, but he may be a project worth investing in immediately. Lastly is kind of the total opposite of what I just said with Jalen Williams. Yeah, he could be good one day, but is that really gonna be this year? He's a guard, maybe kind of a wing that's not gonna be prioritized, and if he is being a guard, is he gonna, get minutes over Josh Giddey, SGA? No. Trey Mann, maybe. Not even Aaron Wiggins. I don't know. This just seemed like too much of a reach considering CJ obviously still plans on competing. I'm not entirely sure what to think of the Toons and anyone that's honestly ranked from 9 through 4 since it's such a competitive season. CJ's had 2 lackluster performances thus far and 1 pretty good one, but he's going to need more than a pretty good one in my opinion if he wants to make it to the semifinals again. I'm not a fan of what he did this offseason because he basically didn't do anything, and from my perspective the Toons had arguably the most important offseason in the league. He should have secured 1 or 2 more great keepers to solidify his core as a threatening presence in the West, but it's more like a roundup of a few A-list players and a handful that aren't guaranteed to take another jump. CJ's draft is good enough to be in contention for best draft, and it definitely helped supplement his roster better, but again, it's just so stacked in the league this year that I wouldn't even be surprised if the Toons were a lottery team, but I also wouldn't be too surprised if they were the 4th seed. For now, I can't comfortably place him higher than 6th, so in my estimation, this will be the last year in Los Angeles for CJ. In 5th place comes a team whose all-time record of 2-34 is about to finally progress, the Stars. Gary had one of the most important off-seasons heading into the summer, and although I kind of disagree with the direction he took, there's no denying the otherworldly improvement his roster made and how successful of an off-season he truly had. After I thought Sam had the worst season anyone could ever have in league history in Season 2, Gary upped that by literally having the worst season anyone could ever have, going 0-19 and for the most part, hardly ever even having a shot to actually win a matchup. It was a disaster, and one I foresaw coming as I predicted him to finish with only 2 dubs on the season, but even that was too many. His team was just completely unpolished polished all around. From a handful of injury-riddled veterans, to off-putting decisions on certain keepers and draft selections, to a wide variety of young or unproven talent, the Stars simply lacked stars. And Gary didn't do his team any favors throughout the course of the season either, pretty much unconsciously setting his lineup and never really making any significant moves or providing enough effort to actually give LA any hope at all. Regardless, this team is 1,000 times better now because Gary finally pulled the trigger and made some big-time trades. I do think he's cutting a few corners and it won't be the best decision for his long-term success, but when you win a total of 2 games in 2 seasons, pretty much any kind of development is good. Gary will finally be competing for a playoff spot this year, maybe even contending if everything goes perfectly, but I still don't think he's necessarily a lock for the postseason, considering his history as a GM, the talent of the other teams ranked both below and above him, and lastly his keepers, which are pretty good but still have some holes and issues that can prevent further fortune. The problem I have with the Stars are that their keepers are very top-heavy. I'm talking after the first 3 or 4, I don't really like anyone all that much. Obviously, Gary's biggest offseason acquisition came in the craziest trade the DBL has ever seen when he acquired Joel Embiid from Maryland for Anthony Davis. This was an amazing move because, like Kristaps Porzingis, Anthony Davis is practically unplayable at this point. I know he's not going to sit out every season forever, but man, not only did he barely play over the last 2 seasons, he did not look like the best version of Anthony Davis either, whatsoever. I'm sure that's going to change, but AD getting traded was like a requirement for my offseason checklist for the Stars. Even if he didn't blow it up, which I would have done if I were him, AD had to go because he just needed a different face of the franchise. And Embiid is literally AD 2.0 in fantasy. He's going to average like 10 more fantasy points and he's a top 5 player to own. But he's also AD 2.0 because of his injury history, and while he's remained pretty healthy over the past 2 years, I don't know if I can count on that 3 years straight. It's a similar situation, but Embiid is one of the best players in the league, so it's more comforting to have that possibility with him than AD. Darius Garland has been the lone bright spot for Gary over the past season and a half and remains a trade I wish I never made, but DG is a DBL All-Star and is only getting better. Jaylen Brown is also the newest Los Angeles Star and he instantly becomes Gary's 3rd best keeper in my opinion. There's some concern that Malcolm Brogdon could take away a little production and that this might be the best version of Jaylen Brown we ever see, which isn't really amazing considering he only averaged 24 fantasy points in his prime, but I do think it was just a down year this past season where he was still very good by the way, and he'll go back up to 25 or 26. And Kawhi is obviously a stud when he plays, but come on, do you really want to own Kawhi? Maybe the constant headaches of Kyrie and Porzingis just haunted my dreams, but Kawhi is going to load manage the whole season, he's not going to play back-to-backs, he might not even go full strength until the NBA playoffs roll around, and we still haven't seen him back from his ACL tear, so there's even a possibility he's not as good. I highly doubt that, but I would not want to own him because he's only going to play like 55 games this season. And while Kawhi can still be dominant for the Stars, the rest of the keepers are big what-ifs. Jordan Poole came along with Embiid in the 4-way trade, and he's definitely got potential to improve his game once again, but it's an odd situation in Golden State with all of their players. He's young, and I do love his chances of becoming a star moving forward, but for this season, his outlook could only be like 20 fantasy points. However, if Steph or Clay or even Andrew Wiggins goes down, Poole could average 24 fantasy points for all I know. He's got a scary amount of potential, but I'm not quite sure what to expect this season. Miles Turner is someone I also have never really liked. Since 2016, I've waited for him to flourish into an all-star, but that's just never going to happen at this point. He's a great player for what he does, but he can't rebound the basketball well, and more importantly, he can't stay healthy. He averages under 23 fantasy points, and while he's a good player to have on your roster, I don't like him as a keeper. Now, the number 2 overall pick in Jalen Green was pretty miserable in fantasy last year until the final month where he finally started to show what he was capable of, and Gary got him for essentially nothing, so I approve of this keeper because he will be really good one day. But I'm not sure it's going to be in his second season, and this type of keeper doesn't really fit with the integrity of the rest of his keepers because although I wish this was more of the route Gary took the Stars in this offseason with like younger guys and a true kind of fresh start, Jalen Green is likely going to be a hole in the firepower of the rest of the squad. He averaged 14 fantasy points last year, and while it's very plausible that he can raise that to at least 18, I'm not big on the fit with the rest of the team. Lastly, Saddiq Bey is a pretty good player that dropped a 50 piece last season, but Gary had Franz Wagner, to me the clearly better young asset that made all-rookie first team, yet the Stars elected to go with Bey instead. He could definitely be the better option, especially in fantasy, as the Pistons don't really have shit, and the Magic are crowded with young guys trying to figure it out, but to me, even Franz was better than Jalen Green, so it just seemed like an odd decision. Overall, the Stars, they have some tantalizing options and a few young pieces that could hypothetically do really well this year, but either way, the mixture of talent is not going to help Gary out. The young assets will likely hold the Stars back from truly being a force this season, and the elite keepers or old veterans will make it hard for Gary to actually keep rebuilding, so in my opinion, the consensus on the Stars nucleus is a bit of a mixed bag. Luckily for Gary, however, when you go 0-19, you usually wind up with the first pick in the draft, and Gary was able to obtain Paolo Banchero because of it. Although I don't blame him for being interested in Chet, Paolo was the NBA's #1 overall pick and is set to average 20 to 22 fantasy points as a rook, and will definitely be a great player for years to come. There's still some concern with the Magic's lineup, but he's clearly starting and getting most of the minutes. With the 10th pick in the draft, Gary fell victim to being a Sixers fan by selecting Tobias Harris. I mean, he did average 22 fantasy points last year and has been a pretty consistent auxiliary piece, but he showed signs of declining, and that's likely going to occur this year. As the fourth option now, it's going to be difficult for him to be as relevant as he was a few seasons ago. I'm expecting like 19 fantasy points, which isn't horrible and will help the stars, but with guys like Kuzma, Jalen Smith, and even Lowry still available, I'd prefer them. Shortly after, Gary went with Jamal Murray, and yet again, this is a good addition to an already above average group of keepers. I don't love Murray, and I never have. He needs to work his way back to game shape after being out for over a year, and he still hasn't proven to being an electrifying fantasy points donor, averaging around 21 per game since he's a chucker that doesn't get many assists or boards, but that's still a pretty good player to bring onto a team that has playoff hopes. He just needs to stay healthy. Next up, the Stars elected to go with Mikal Bridges, and I actually think this is probably the worst choice of his. I like him as a player, and he may very well improve from the subpar fantasy point average of 18 to maybe 20 or 21, but Bobby Portis and Brandon Clark were definitely the better options that Gary unfortunately dropped in favor of Mikal. Portis averaged like 23 fantasy points last year, and Clark is always good when JJJ isn't playing. I don't hate the Bridges pick, but I don't expect him to be a must-roster player by any stretch of the imagination either, so it's not a great look over those other two. He also dropped Bones Highland, which is definitely one of the three that I would have dropped, but there's also a chance he has a Tyrese Maxey-like sophomore season. Maybe not quite as good, but I'm at least envisioning a world where a lot of league members use him as one of their weekly pickups. Gary's final addition is one of my favorites in Benedict Mathurin, who has a dark horse chance at Rookie of the Year in my opinion. The Pacers suck, and he'll arguably be their number 2 option, maybe even first option by the end of the year, since Halliburton is kind of a more pass-first point guard. There's a good chance he'll be average, since it's always the same song and dance with rookies. You never really know what you're going to get, but I feel like Gary got one of the steals of the draft. In conclusion, Los Angeles is about to have a season unlike one they've ever had and are the clear frontrunner for most improved. Gary executed some big-time trades in the offseason and showed us a glimpse of how passionate a manager he can be. But there's still work to be done, and this isn't really a contender yet unless everyone he kept actually stays healthy and everyone he drafted goes for 21-plus fantasy points. But we just know Kawhi isn't playing a lot, and Embiid and Turner have their woes too. I'm excited for the future of the Stars, and I think it's going to be a really enjoyable season for the fans, but until Gary irons out the back end of his roster and truly displays a hunger that shows he's in it to win it, 5th place is where he'll fall. Rounding out the top 4 for me is a team that could finish as low as 7th, but I still have some faith in the Maryland McLovins to be a promising competitor. Josh is a champion, that's something that can never be taken away, but we're about to be 2 seasons removed from that, and for the most part, the McLovins have made a lot of the wrong choices following Maryland's parade year.
Wait, what? You talking about me? Alright, nah.
Last season, Josh was 1 loss away from being a lottery team, which would have made it very easy to call his championship a fluke. And while I'm not going to say that because we can't forget how dominant the McLovins were in 2021, last year saw Josh make poor move after poor move, completely changing the outlook of his team. And when it comes to analyzing how he'll be for year number 4, he's closer to mimicking last year's performance as opposed to his winning path. He's already made some confusing trades, like parting ways with Joel Embiid after only owning him for a month. He might have got a decent amount back, which we'll get into, but he also gave up Chris Paul and Kevin Durant. Chris Paul is a little understandable due to age and health, but these were 3 DBL All-Stars last season. Like I said, KD has an injury history, so, it seems like something you can bet on happening every year around January. I don't mind exploring the market for him, but when you give him up for 4th rounders and Ben Simmons, I'm not sure what you're doing as a contender. You can make the argument that Josh just traded away his 3 best players for no reason. It's not like his team is in a clear position to rebuild or anything, and that's certainly not the approach he's taking, so I'm not convinced about the reasoning behind any of this. His team just got worse in my opinion, and even though he has a solid assortment of draft compensation, is it really worth it? Now, Josh's keepers are really good, but I don't even really know who his best player is. I guess it's Anthony Davis, but if I haven't made it clear over the past few years, I'm not the biggest fan of him. He's a pretty excellent player, but he's easily on the all-injury first team for current players, probably including Porzingis, Kyrie, Hayward, and Brogdon off the top of my head. But yeah, I have no faith in him remaining healthy for an extended period of time. He was like this on the Pelicans too, but people didn't really talk about it because no one cares about the Pelicans. What's even a little more concerning to me is how much of a shell of himself he's played like since being in LA. His first year was still very good, but it wasn't New Orleans numbers, which should have been expected when playing next to LeBron, but still, it was a little bit of a drop-off. Ever since then, he's fallen off in scoring and hasn't averaged 10 rebounds in any year with the Lakers. Okay, he averaged 9.9 this last season, but it's still factual that it hasn't been 10. 9 is obviously right there, but the year before that was under 8. I do think he'll have somewhat of a resurgence in the box score this season, but I don't think he'll be playing many games either. Jimmy Butler is awesome, but he's another year older and also has a lot of injury concerns, playing in under 60 games last year. Rudy Gobert, who was probably Josh's best fantasy player last year outside of the Embiid investment, might take a tiny step back playing next to Towns. His job is to get boards and blocks, and he's likely still going to average over 10 points per game, but his scoring duties are basically extinct. He's literally the fourth option offensively now, but it shouldn't really hinder his game too much. If anything, Towns is the one who's going to suffer, and his fantasy production will drop more. Donovan Mitchell only averaged 24 fantasy points last year, which is very good, but for a player of his caliber, you might expect a little more from him, especially considering he was basically the only true offensive option on the Jazz. Now he's playing next to Garland, Mobley, Allen, and LeVert. I definitely foresee his numbers dropping with the change in scenery. Not by a substantial amount, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's only averaging 22 fantasy points in Cleveland. Zach LaVine is in the same kind of tier as fantasy player, and honestly, real-life player too. He took a step back with DeRozan leading the charge in Chicago, and although I do believe he was playing on a bad knee all season and was trying to get acclimated to all of his new teammates, he still only averaged 23 fantasy points as opposed to his nearly 27 without DeRozan. He's one of my favorite players in the league, and dealing him was really tough, especially when you factor in his SGSF eligibility, but there is some concern that this is just the type of fantasy asset he's going to be as long as he's the second option. However, I do think he'll return to about 25 fantasy points as the Bulls get more comfortable with each other. But if LaVine is the second best player Josh got back this offseason, and the second best player he gave up was KD, who's better than Anthony Davis too, I'd be worried. I lied though, because Capella is the more notable fantasy option, but his role just confuses and concerns me. He regressed last season and got his minutes cut too. If Nkongwu manages to outplay him or even match his minutes total, I'd be very nervous. I'm not saying he's a terrible keeper, especially when 2 seasons ago he averaged fucking 33 fantasy points, but for that to drop 7 fantasy points to 26 in just 1 year is pretty alarming. He's a really good fantasy player still, but I'd be scared to own him. And the even scarier dude to own is Ben Simmons. Like, look, Simmons is a good fantasy player, but his lack of playing is more worrisome than Zion. Even though he's slated to return and play a healthy workload, you have to imagine he sits back-to-backs and gets hurt at another point in time. And without all that, he only averaged 26 fantasy points in his last season and never improved as a player since coming into the NBA. Clearly, 26 fantasy points is still a great keeper, but it's all the baggage and expectations that come with Ben. Hopefully he plays 65 plus games and averages 20, 10, and 10, but as the third option as opposed to the second option now, I don't see that happening. And lastly, the McLovins elected to keep D'Angelo Russell. Why? He averaged 20 fantasy points and hasn't been a consistent or reliable option for a handful of seasons now. And in that 4-way deal, I got Chris Middleton. If I was Josh, I'm saying, hold up, I'm getting Chris Middleton because he's the better player. But apparently nobody wanted the 23 fantasy points of Chris Middleton this year, and I don't understand why when 80% of the teams in the DBL could have used him as a better keeper than someone they currently have. Regardless, D'Lo is not a keeper-worthy piece anymore until he proves it again, but I don't know if that day is ever coming. To summarize, Maryland still has a pretty fantastic set of mainstay players, but they were not even arguably, but almost factually better before the offseason began. There's also a lot of scrutiny that comes with a majority of these guys, so while there's stuff to like, there's a lot you'd want to distance yourself from as well. However, Josh's draft isn't half bad. It's not the kind of draft that's going to help him win the league or anything, but it's a solid group of win-now pieces that may even do better than expected. Josh didn't pick until 24, but managed to snag Mitchell Robinson here. That's pretty damn good. He's not incredible, but still, at a young age, he averaged 21 fantasy points last season. There's no reason to suggest he can't replicate that, and there's even a possibility he finally takes that step forward that everyone's been waiting for. I wouldn't put stock into that, but a 20-plus fantasy point player for the third round is a more than acceptable pick. Included in this round is Josh Hart, who I also really like. I'm concerned with all the new additions around him that the 22 fantasy points he averaged was only because the Blazers had a G League team at the end of last season, but he's still a Swiss Army knife contributor that could even average close to what he did last year. Next up, the McLovins went with Buddy Hield, and even though he averaged 18, 5, and 5 in Indiana, I don't see that happening again. It seems inevitable he'll be traded at some point, and with the Pacers being terrible, they'll want to play Mathurin, Duarte, and other young guys as much as possible. Aside from half a season in Indiana, Buddy has never gotten past his Klay Thompson-esque aura in fantasy, where he really doesn't offer much of anything other than shooting. And with his final 2 picks, Josh took reliably decent veterans to fill out his bench in Steven Adams and Harrison Barnes. He immediately dropped Barnes for his teammate in Mitchell, and I can see the appeal in him, but I think he's not enough of a focal point to have any true success in fantasy this year, and Barnes probably won't even be as good as last year with Keegan cutting into his role. Adams, I don't mind. He was a fine rotation piece for a fantasy team last year that could get you like 19 fantasy points, but he was unplayable in the postseason, and with the Grizzlies' depth and variety of youngsters, his minutes might continue to decrease. I've been pretty harsh on the outlook of Maryland this season, but I still have them at 4th for a couple of reasons. For starters, I have no fucking clue how to rank most of these middle pack teams, so the first thing to realize is that I'm probably wrong. Secondly, even with a step down in his keepers and worse core from a season ago, there's still a lot of potential for the McLovins to be a second round squad, or possibly even go further with the level of talent here. Gobert, AD, Jimmy, Donovan Mitchell, Levine, Simmons, Capella, and a functional cast of fantasy role players makes for a harrowing matchup with Maryland each week. The issue is that, like I said, a lot of these guys are injury prone and just aren't as good as most of the keepers Josh locked in a year prior, which saw him finish even lower at 6th place. But assuming everyone lives up to their expectations and actually stays on the court, Josh could easily be at the top of the standings once again. He'll just need to make decisions and trades that represent his mindset from 2021. I don't have a lot of faith after what the past year has entailed, and that's why I wouldn't be surprised if the McLovins finished in the lottery, but I also wouldn't double take to see them pushing for a top 3 seed. Next up, collecting the bronze medal from my perspective is going to be the newly rebranded Flint, Michigan Tropics. As I've already exclaimed, this entire ranking has been extremely difficult to accurately pinpoint because, truth be told, I feel like a couple of teams have better rosters and keepers that I ranked behind Cam, but at the same time, I don't think there's anyone else in this league that can outmanage him. Despite just possibly having a weaker group of guys than a few other ball clubs, Cam is undoubtedly the best manager of everyone in the league, excluding the owner of the New Jersey Knights. Douchebag. Take a look at last season for the perfect example on this. Cam was predicted to finish in 9th with a, let's face it, shit squad of keepers. He arguably had the worst keepers heading into Season 3, but this motherfucker made it to the finals and came within 50 points of winning. You can't do that without being a fantastic GM, and Cam clearly pushed all the right buttons last year. However, there may have been a few lucky breaks for the Tropics, with James' team completely dismantled by injuries all year, to some unexpected performances and improvement from a key few members, to the Knights being absolutely decimated by day-to-day players in the postseason. There were some instances where Cam might have had a bit of luck on his side, but all things considered, we all do in fantasy at some point, and for the most part, Cam's 11-8 record for his second place finish was from his doing. It was the way he managed and maneuvered his team, the way he drafted, the way he traded, and everything else that makes an organization better. So although I'm a little torn by how good his keepers are in comparison to some of the more proven talent around the association, they're still arguably the second best keepers in the league, and on top of that, he's a top 2 GM in the DBL as well. I have to trust his presence as a manager at this point, and while I'm not sure if he'll return to the finals, he should easily be a top 3 team all year long. Although the Tropics don't quite have any massively dominant fantasy options at the moment, they could have 3 to 4 top 25 players within 3 years. Hell, if you polled the league on the top 25 dynasty keepers to have over the next 5 years, Cam might have 5 or 6 of them, and they'll still be pretty fucking good this year too. Evan Mobley was basically a co-rookie of the year last year, averaging 24 fantasy points. That's absolutely absurd for a rookie. I think he might up his numbers to 17 and 9 and average close to 27 fantasy points in just his sophomore season. Tyrese Halliburton is entering his 3rd year and may possibly average 18 and 10. Cade Cunningham was also very impressive as a rookie and could potentially average 20 points, 5 rebounds, and 7 assists in his 2nd year. These are 3 super young guys with limitless potential right now. Add in Devin Booker, Cam's all-DBL 3rd team selection, and you've got 4 extremely valuable players. We're not even done with the praise yet, because although I do think Anthony Edwards is not yet that great as a fantasy player, I still believe in him highly to turn it up. I believe he's due for a John Morant-esque breakout season in his 3rd campaign where he averages close to 27 points per game and shoots up to like 25 fantasy points a game. Last season saw him average close to 22, and while it was an improvement from an abysmal rookie year, it was still an inconsistent and underwhelming season. Regardless, Ant-Man is a juicy prospect with sky-high potential. Then how can we fail to mention the former Knight and Wendell Carter Jr., who averaged 25 fantasy points? After 2 incredibly stale seasons following his rookie year, WCJ finally broke out and became a must-roster player. I have some worry that he won't be able to replicate that success again with so many touches and possible stolen boards to go around with all the young guys in Orlando, but even if he dips to like 22 or 23 fantasy points, that's still a pretty above-average player. I'm not even saying he's going to take a step back, because for all we know, he's going to continue to improve and might even average over 27 fantasy points. So either way, Wendell Carter Jr. is certainly a good keeper. Then you have Chris Middleton, who is one of the most consistent and well-rounded fantasy players in the league. He never torches box score matchups for 50 fantasy points every other night, but he'll continuously get you 22 plus night in and night out. For the life of me, I don't understand why the market was so dry for him this offseason when every other team in the DBL, aside from James, could have used him as opposed to whoever their 8th keeper was, or in some instances, whoever their 5th keeper was. He's a little older and doesn't necessarily fit with Cam's timeline, but for a team that just made the finals to be this young overall, why not add a veteran presence that averages 23 to 24 fantasy points, especially for a third and two fourthies. Cam's last keeper I know was a big decision to make because he could have went with Nurkic, he could have went with Wagner, he could have went with John Goddamn Wall, but he couldn't go with DBL All-Star Miles Bridges. However, he wound up selecting Alperen Sengun, which in my eyes was the best player to choose. Sure, Cam wasted picks when he traded for Nurkic and Wagner by ultimately not keeping either of them, but sometimes you have to take an L in order to get a W, and that's exactly what this situation is looking like. While Nurkic is a safe bet for 25 fantasy points, and Wagner has the potential to be an all-star caliber player, I think it's no secret that Sengun's upside as a fantasy asset mimics the likes of Domantas Sabonis and Nikola Jokic. I don't think anyone will ever be quite as good as Jokic in fantasy, but he can easily match or even someday surpass Sabonis in fantasy value. In just 20 minutes per game last year, he averaged 9 points, 5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists. Extrapolate that to 30 minutes a game on top of the probable development Sengun will display as a second-year player, and you've got a keeper that could average 27 plus fantasy points in just his sophomore year. Yes, he's still young and might not pan out this season or at all potentially, but that's the risk you take in a dynasty league. I also think it's worth noting that if this were just a regular redraft league, Sengun would probably still be the better player to take a chance on over Nurkic because of his consistent injuries, and Wagner is in the same boat as Sengun, but with less fantasy attraction. So for Cam's worst keeper, to be someone that has arguably some of the highest upside league-wide is definitely something to be excited about. I'm guessing something like 15 points, 10 rebounds, and 4 assists per game for Alp, which is already the absolute ceiling for Nurkic. Overall, these keepers are A, the youngest in the league, B, better than most rosters while being so fucking young, and C, managed by a guy that can take them further than they have any right to go. We may not see much improvement from his young players this season, or we're going to see a major bump in usage for all of them, which has to have Cam watering at the mouth. Sprinkle in some reliable fantasy options like Devin Booker and Chris Middleton, and you've got one of the best cores in the league. Then, of course, Cam enters the draft as a back-to-back winner of the Best Draft Award, where he will likely be in the conversation for a third consecutive year. The Tropics already have a surplus of youth with exponential upside, and yet he managed to add to that with Chet Holmgren, who a lot of people might say is the best player in the 2022 class. At number 6, that's just insane value, because if he didn't get hurt, he's the consensuous number 1 pick, and if not selected by at least 2, I would have taken him myself at number 3. So yeah, while he is out the whole year and doesn't help the Tropics' chances in Season 4, who gives a fuck? He put him in his IR and got Bobby fucking Portis for free. That's some murder. At number 9, Cam took Desmond Bane as well, who is widely considered to be a special up-and-comer. While not as exciting as someone like Tyrese Maxey, he averaged 19 fantasy points last year in his second season and will help shoulder the load in Memphis with JJJ out for months. He's only going to get better. With his third pick in the lottery, Cam shot for Kevin Porter Jr., and I know there's a lot of hype around him, but I'm not as high on him as Cam obviously appears to be, or as others around the league. I mean, 2 years ago I liked him a lot, but last year was hard to watch. He was inefficient as all hell, a turnover machine, and didn't stuff the stat sheet too much either. During the last 2 months of the season, he finally started playing not only good, but extremely well, and I'm sure that influenced Cam's decision. There's a great chance that this is the year he fully breaks out and averages like 19 points, 7 assists, and 5 rebounds, but honestly, I don't think he will. Jalen Green, Sengun, Jabari Smith, and even fucking Terry Eason will all be cutting into his workload as they take on more usage this year, and I think it's going to be hard for him to find a consistent rhythm. I wouldn't be shocked to see him average 18 fantasy points or less, and I know Cam can't be thrilled about that with guys like Jalen Smith, Franz Wagner, and more still available on the board. With his final 2 picks, Cam chooses a couple of bigs that I have some mixed feelings about. I also had my eye on PJ Washington, what with Miles Bridges sacrificing the starting 4 spot and the Kentucky product seemingly being the favorite to start in his place and finally break out. But from what I've seen so far in preseason has worried me, and I have a bad feeling he's going to remain stagnant without taking advantage of this opportunity. Alas, I would have taken him shortly after if available still, so I understand because the potential to average around 19 and 7 is there, which is basically what Bridges supplied last year. And Nick Claxton I also get. I mean, the Nets have no bigs, and he's shown when actually receiving minutes that he's worthy of rostering, but I still just don't really trust the situation. It's clear that Cam could have gotten a steal at this point of the draft, but there's a chance Brooklyn starts him and only plays him like 23 minutes a game to get Simmons or KD playing small ball center, maybe even Day'Ron Sharpe. I don't know, either way he's worth the risk because if he plays 30 minutes a game, he could potentially average 13 and 10. While I don't think this draft is as marvelous as Cam's previous season, he did very well with the spots he chose at, and again wound up with Chet fucking Holmgren because 4 idiots passed on him. The Tropics already have a stacked young core that should see a majority of them improve past their already above average fantasy numbers, and bringing in other players in a similar boat makes a lot of sense. There's not really much of anything negative to say about Cam's offseason or upcoming crusade. He might have made a couple of ill-advised trades for nothing, but a good manager knows when not to make things worse and just accepts the mistake. I can't see Flint finishing lower than 4th, and the only thing in Cam's way are the 2 juggernauts ahead of him, but there's still a great possibility he returns to the finals and even gets his first ring. Finishing in second place this year is someone who suffered a bit of a step back last season due to an absurd amount of sideline players, and that is of course going to be James Taylor, aka the recently relocated Las Vegas Whales. Although I've been overly critical of James over the past 2 years or so, he still has one of the best teams in the league by a mile. His group of keepers, which we'll get into in a sec, are debatably the best in the DBL, and the way he drafts and scans the wire typically lead to a successful regular season. However, I still take issue with a good deal of the actions that James decides on, especially if he ever wants to win a title or at the very least make his team better. He did nothing this offseason and essentially nothing all of last year, and he still has the second best team. Imagine he put forth some effort in maximizing his draft capital or surrounding his already elite roster with more firepower. It's no secret that the pandemic took a championship away from James in season 1, but he's done nothing since then to prove that he actually deserves that ring. Last year, the biggest storyline with James, which I mentioned all video, was the abundance of injuries his team suffered from. There was truly nothing James could do to offset the amount of players with an O next to their name. Even if he had actually made moves to increase his chances at a title, I definitely don't see an outcome where he could have won with such limited pieces performing for him. Still, with that being said, James finished with a winning percentage of 53% at 10-9. That's one less game than CJ at 11-8, who got the conference title. Had James simply quote-unquote cared at the end of the season, let alone actually tried to improve his team, he would have had his third consecutive conference title and been a lock for the semifinals. At that point, anything could happen, and with the amount of injuries I faced in the playoffs, if he got to the finals, he very well could have won. So forget me saying there's no universe where he could have had a championship, because you never really know, and it's proof that you should always try in fantasy. Where James really faltered for me, though, was when he dropped CJ McCollum and Gordon Hayward for nothing. As a contender especially, that's unacceptable. He spent a first-round pick on CJ McCollum, and I know he wasn't too consistent for the first half of the season, and then got injured on top of all the other injuries James already had, but he literally came back and played phenomenally, which could have gotten James that first seed if he held on to him, or at the very least he could have traded him for like a second or third round pick. And I know Hayward is a pretty lost asset at this point too, but Cam picked him up and immediately flipped him for a third himself. So to me, that's very disappointing when James is clearly a supremely knowledgeable fan of basketball and has the roster to compete on any given night. Even worse, though, is that he repeated this offense in the offseason when he lost a slew of talented players for nothing because he didn't make any trades. Clearly, I have him as the number 2 team in the league, so it's almost like he didn't have to, but you're really going to lose Tyrese Maxey, Desmond Bane, Jamal Murray, Kevin Porter Jr., and a few others for nothing? Those 4 players literally went in the top 13, and 5 of the guys he dropped went in the top 21. That needs to be corrected if the Whales plan on remaining a force in this league. As I already mentioned, James' list of keepers are terrific, but like a lot of other teams, when you dig a little deeper, you start to uncover a few reasons to be concerned. James Harden, for instance, had a major step back of a season by his standards in the NBA last year, but he was still a starting DBL All-Star at 35 fantasy points per game. That cements Harden as one of the best assets in the league, but I would still be a little nervous considering he's another year older and has shown over the past 2 years that his body is starting to break down. On the other hand, I do believe he put in a lot of work this offseason to position himself for his best year scoring-wise and overall since before his initial hamstring injury, but there's still that voice in the back of my head that's telling me James should be willing to hear offers for Harden and trade him while he still has maximum value, because within the next 2 years, I wouldn't be surprised if his value was astronomically lower than it is now. Obviously, don't trade Harden for scraps, but especially if the team is not looking like a contender by the deadline, I would not even hesitate to ship him out and go in a different direction. I know I said ouf, and I meant to say out, and I went ouf. Yeah, I've been talking for so long, I don't want to keep redoing my recording, so let's just stick with me here. And the same exact things could potentially be said about Damian Lillard. He's a pure hooper that had an oddly lackluster season last year, averaging barely 24 fantasy points. That's still pretty good, but that's essentially what Chris Middleton averaged, and yet nobody wanted him? Do you mean to tell me if Lillard was available, somebody wouldn't have offered 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and a good player to obtain him? Clearly, Lillard is 1,000 times more valuable than Middleton, but the point still stands. Anyway, this guy should be averaging like 28 fantasy points, but I do believe last season was an anomaly where Dame just suffered some unfortunate injuries and will reinvent himself this year with virtually no defined second option alongside him. I think he's going to be in store for over 30 fantasy points again, but also he is 32 years old already, and with injuries catching up to him, there's reason to be concerned, and the same theories I had with Harden can be applied to Lillard as well. They're clearly still 2 of the best players in the league though, and when your third best keeper is Bam Adebayo, you're in great shape. He just needs to show he can remain on the court to really make a difference. At 4th we have Bradley Beal though, which again is a former superstar-esque level guard in this league who dipped in production last year and wound up hurt for a majority of the season. Beal averaged barely 23 fantasy points in a season where he didn't have Westbrook taking up a lot of his ball handling duties. With a pretty insignificant roster, you would have imagined Beal would be a near untouchable asset at this point in time, but Zach LaVine, who had a down year and turned into the second option, managed to be better as a fantasy player. All I'm saying is that once again, with one of James' elite keepers, I'm concerned. I know he was injured, but that's kind of always the story with Beal, and I honestly think he's just disinterested in playing for Washington now, and that he needs a new environment to reinvent himself, much like CJ McCollum in NOLA. I do think he'll be much better than last season, but still, James should be kind of scared if I'm being honest, considering his most significant trade in the past 365 days was trading a second for an injured Jamal Murray who didn't play a single game for him, then didn't even keep. Number 5 is an underrated fantasy asset in Jakob Poeltl, who averaged 26 fantasy points last season. Remember when I tried to sell him to all of you for a 4th rounder before you made me drop him for nothing? Yeah, you can all suck a bag of dicks, because this guy's worth like a 1st and a 3rd now. The Spurs are going to suck ass, and Jakob could hypothetically turn into the first option in San Antonio. I don't really think that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if he averaged over 28 fantasy points. Next up is FVV, who had an absolutely dazzling first half of the season and became both a first-time All-Star in the NBA and the DBL, but he cooled off to the tune of 24 fantasy points. He's still very valuable, but James might not see his production increase with the emergence of Scottie Barnes and the fact that Freddie took a backseat to Siakam as well. Now, James' last 2 keepers I don't really like. They get the job done as fantasy players, but on no earth do I want to personally keep John Collins over Tyrese Maxey. Collins averaged 23 to Maxey's 19, but Maxey is younger and primed to improve with each season of his young career, and while Collins is also pretty young, I don't know if we'll ever be getting anything more than what we've seen out of him already. He seemed to decrease his counting stats over the past 2 seasons anyway, and with DeJounte Murray stealing boards and touches too, he might not even average 22 fantasy points this year. I honestly think Maxey will be better in fantasy this season alone, so I don't know why the hell James didn't trade someone, but now we get to Michael Porter Jr., who's arguably a bigger what the fuck is going to happen to him storyline than Zion or Ben Simmons. He's extremely talented, but he's been plagued with bad injury issues during his short career. If MPJ's stock was at an all-time high after last year, it's almost the complete opposite now because I don't know how the rest of the league feels, but I would not make a good offer for MPJ if James texted me asking if I was interested in him. I would have kept Desmond Bane, and again, if he wanted to keep Collins over Bane, fine, but then I would have kept Maxey over MPJ and traded MPJ to the first sucker that offered me a first. He could be insanely good, you could see the Kevin Durant-isms in his game, but that's not a risk I'm willing to take given his history, especially when I got a young stud in Maxey who I could keep instead. Basically, James' keepers are fantastic, and I'm kind of looking at this core with a glass-half-empty viewpoint, but they're not going to be as injured as last year, so this team should already win an additional 2 games. He's ranked at number 2 for a reason. He's got one of the best rosters available. However, as I've highlighted, there's a myriad of reasons that it could completely fall apart, and I'm not stoked at all about the future of this organization, but as of this season, it's still a very intimidating team to go up against. When we take a look at his draft, though, it's somewhere in the middle for me. Yusuf Nurkic made absolute sense for Vegas, and I strongly considered him as well, but I knew he'd end up on the Whales once I passed on him. He's 25 to 26 fantasy points per game, maybe even more if he stays healthy and gets into a rhythm, but that's the singular biggest issue in Nurkic and probably why Cam wasn't able to trade him this offseason. He's constantly sidelined, and you have to expect at some point that'll be the case again this year. I'm hopeful it's not, but that was a huge factor in my decision not to draft him. Next is Sexton, who a lot of people are clamoring over, and I see the attraction, but I'm still not really sold. He seems like an empty stats kind of guy, which obviously who gives a shit about in fantasy, that's great, but he's a scorer who can't do anything else. Preceding his injury, the year before in Cleveland saw him average 24 points on 47% from the field and 37% from 3. That sounds pretty great, but he only averaged a wimpy 21 fantasy points because he doesn't rack up any assists or rebounds. He's a purely one-dimensional player that will have free reign in Utah, and maybe he'll set career-high marks in this new environment. I get it, I get the appeal, but we still might only be looking at 20 or 21 fantasy points, and while that is a pretty decent snag for the 16th pick, I wouldn't be surprised if Sexton carves out a 6th-man role for himself in the very near future. Jeremy Grant, or Jeremy Grant as some people like to call him, at number 25, not bad. I'm not in love with the guy, but he could get James 18 or 19 fantasy points, which it's respectable enough, but he may even diminish lower with more offensive options around him as opposed to in Detroit. Jalen Duren, speaking of Detroit, I just don't know if he's going to start, but he might gobble up boards in limited minutes, but of course there's also a chance he is limited in playtime and consistency. Finally, after the mistake of taking a 5th center in Kelly Olynyk, James swapped him out for Shaedon Sharpe, which I'm not a fan of. I mean, he may be a good rookie and have a promising future, but this year playing behind Lillard and other guards, he doesn't really belong on the Whales, and I'd imagine James will be letting go of him soon. Las Vegas is once again going to be a powerhouse in the DBL, as so many Whales that were out of the lineup last year are back and are probably hungrier than ever to pop off, but they come with a lot of concern, some immediate, most most within the next couple of years, but as it pertains to James and this season, the Whales are in good shape to make another finals run. He added some justifiable supporting pieces, but other than Nurkic, nothing too wildly encouraging. The main facet of fantasy James has to work on, though, is when to make trades, whether that's during the year to lift his team's chances of winning a championship or in the offseason to gain some draft capital for guys he literally can't keep because he has so many keepers. If he can figure those things out, the sky is the limit for Las Vegas.
What season?
The season where I went 17-2, and
You won 17-2?
I went 17-2.
You gotta stop making it.
You lost twice?
Did I do that?
Loser!
Well, paint me the villain of the goddamn league, because not only did I predict I'd win last year and wind up doing so, but I'm doubling down because I really like my chances once again. I kind of hate ranking myself number one because it feels very pompous, but at the same time, I am an annoyingly self-deprecating piece of shit who never seems to find any reason to compliment himself. Let me actually have this one. Fantasy basketball might be the only thing I can actually do right in my life, and if you don't believe me, check the tapes on last season. It was remarkable, and I'm honestly so proud of myself. I had a great team the first 2 years, but last year was basically a fantasy team for a fantasy league. It was unbeatable. Now, I don't want to sit here and suck my own dick for 2 hours, but believe me, I try to, and I would if I could. But let me briefly summarize all the moves I made that turned my already fantastic roster into an unquestioned championship team. I traded for Vucevic, Valanciunas, DeMar DeRozan, Jaylen Brown, and a couple of picks in the draft that wound up being Jarrett Allen and Josh Giddey. I was extremely active on the wire, nabbing Cole Anthony, Josh Hart, and Mo Bamba, who were all astounding at some point during the season, and I managed my team perfectly throughout the playoffs to the point that I had a season-ending amount of injuries, but still wound up winning. Anybody can say, well, if anyone had Joe's team, they'd win, but I honestly think if you gave anyone else the New Jersey Knights at the start of last offseason, they wouldn't have won. It's because of what I did, the moves I made, the trades I completed, the guys I drafted, and my overall managerial talent that brought NJ a championship. Because let's face it, there's so much luck that goes into fantasy, and you have to be willing to plan for that and combat it to the best of your ability. It's extremely hard to win in fantasy with all the shit you just cannot ever predict or foresee coming. Just ask Josh, who won 2 seasons ago but found himself as a fringe playoff team last year. Everything has to go right to win a championship, but I assisted those convenient situations with good precision and great management. And although I've obviously predicted myself to go back-to-back, it's going to be wildly challenging, especially when my core isn't quite at its fullest potential. Last year, my keepers were stacked all the way through. While they're all still extremely good and most of them are making a return, there's some belief that a few could take a step backwards and not perform as magically as they did last season. That's completely negated with Luka Doncic, who we still haven't seen the best from yet, so that should be scary for the league. Sabonis is an immaculate player who I count as an untouchable, but I'm curious to see if his stats are going to take a dip with a more balanced roster in Sacramento this season. In Indiana the past 2 years, everyone was hurt, and that saw his usage rise even higher, but he was still an all-star the year before that even. With Fox being the number one option, we could see his numbers slightly go down, but on the other hand, his assists might just rise too. Either way, you can book him for at least 32 fantasy points. Ja is also just starting to unlock how fucking good he can be because like Luka, we still haven't seen the best from him. I am concerned with his health though. Just like Derrick Rose, he twists and contorts his body with so much explosiveness all the time that I'm a little scared, especially since he's been pretty prone to injuries thus far, but if he can avoid anything serious, this guy has like prime Russell Westbrook level potential in terms of fantasy. And Jarrett Allen is only 24 and just became an all-star and averaged 30 fantasy points per game. I am a little worried that Mobley is going to wind up overtaking his stats and production because he's clearly the more talented player than Jarrett, but his impact is comparable to Gobert, who's been one of the best and most reliable fantasy options since like 2015. Siakam was absolutely insane last year. I don't even know how to put into words my admiration and gratefulness for his contributions. 2 years ago, people were calling him a Spinny P and essentially wrote him off even though his numbers were not that far removed from his all-star campaign the year prior. But it was noticeable enough that even I thought I had to trade him, especially since he was coming into Season 3 injured. I offered him to Josh for Harrison Barnes and a first. So I don't know if I'm more of a dumbass or if Josh is for not accepting that, but that's how much the interest around him league-wide dropped. Keep in mind, this was at the start of the year before Siakam returned and when Barnes was averaging like 26 fantasy points, but even then I knew that was unsustainable for him, which it was because he dropped to like 18 at the end of the year, so either way I made a terrible trade offer. Regardless, Pascal started a little rocky when he came back in like November, but once he started to find his rhythm at the end of December, he was in a groove until the end of the year. He was unbelievable, averaging a career high in rebounds and assists to go along with over 30 fantasy points. I'm saying all this to say, the chances of him replicating that are slim to none. With Scotty looking better and better every day, Siakam might take a step back again. He's proven to be streaky over his career, and in the first 2 years of the DBL, he averaged 26 fantasy points, which is still very helpful, but 30 is a level I wasn't sure Siakam could reach a year ago. If he can duplicate that, then he will be a confirmed elite fantasy talent, and he's already super valuable, but I'm not entirely sure how this season will play out for him. Now that I spent 20 minutes talking about Siakam, his former teammate in DeRozan was even more shocking last year. After 3 highly underrated seasons in San Antonio where DeMar took a bit of a step back offensively in terms of scoring, he had his literal best season ever. He averaged 28 fantasy points. Yeah, he averaged 26 the year prior, but I assumed in Chicago he'd be taking a back seat and we'd be looking at like 23 fantasy points, but no, he got even better. Again, it seems highly unlikely he can sustain this level of play, but even if he takes a bit of a dip, we're looking at 26 fantasy points, which is better than what I initially thought I was trading for. Now, with my last 2 keepers, you could start asking questions like, wouldn't you rather have any of the 4 fantastic fantasy options you traded away over who you kept? Because Vucevic at nearly 29 fantasy points, JV at nearly 30, Jalen at 24, and Levine at 23 provides a lot of different options compared to the old age and health concerns of Chris Paul and the inexperienced youthfulness of Josh Giddey. But I got a lot of draft capital, and I got Chris Paul, who is factually better than all those guys last season. But I've been critical of Chris Paul since the DBL started, citing his age and long list of injuries as reasons to steer clear from him. I found it hard to believe he'd still be an all-star, all-NBA, fucking MVP level player at this point in his career, but here we are. I have no reason to believe he's going to fall off of a cliff production-wise after what he's shown. His stats may still drop, but I can't really see a universe where he's averaging less than 27 fantasy points. The big thing though for him is remaining healthy and not getting hurt, which he's done pretty decently over the past 3 seasons, give or take, but it still happened and it's hard to put too much faith in him. Either way, this is a guy that clearly supplements my contending pieces while I managed to get value for all the other players I traded, so you can't really complain. And like I said, you can make the argument that it makes more sense to keep JV or Vooch or Jaylen Brown over Josh Giddey because they're established and going to get you 25 plus fantasy points a night, while Giddey doesn't really fit with the timeline as much, especially if I'm coming off a championship and looking to go back to back. I did this with Tyler Hero in the past because I believed in him and it bit me in the ass, so the same thing could happen. The difference is that Giddey is already a good fantasy player that averaged 21 fantasy points in his rookie year. No, that's not making my jaw drop, but what is are his stats of 12 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 assists. If Gidd develops the way I hope, we are looking at a Jason Kidd-esque prime Rondo type of game here. He needs to get a 3-point shot, and there's a chance he ends up more like Ricky Rubio than those other comparisons, but my god, the upside is mouthwatering. No, I'm not keeping Nikola fucking Vucevic over him. This is a dynasty league, right? I'm playing the long game just as much as I'm playing the short game. The Knights are trying to build a future while consistently competing. In other words, a true dynasty. There's a great chance Giddey doesn't evolve much this season, but I'm 100% in on his potential, and for my worst keeper to be this exciting, I am fucking pumped. So overall, I might have the best keepers in the league, and a number of them haven't even shown their best yet, like Luka, Ja, Giddey, and Jared Allen. For 4 of my core to be this young and this good is fucking awesome, and my other 4 are proven fantasy all-stars as well. There may be some worry that a handful of these guys don't repeat their miraculous stat lines from last year's championship run, but you've still got to give it up for the talent on display here. My draft, though, I'm a bit unsure about. I was one of the fuckfaces that passed up on Chet Holmgren, but at least it makes some sense. Like, I literally just came off a championship. Why draft someone that can't contribute to my team? The flip side of that is that he's going to be a future star player, and I could have put him in my IR or traded him for something near the deadline, but you could probably see where I'm coming from. You might not see where I'm coming from by taking Jabari Smith over him, and I'm not exactly sure I do either. Maybe I was frazzled that Chet was actually available to me, and I was sure I'd be drafting Jabari anyway, but a rookie that may not pan out this season is a pretty huge risk for a team like the Knights. A lot of people don't seem too high on him, but at worst I feel like he's going to average 14 and 7 on inefficient shooting splits, which would probably be good for 17 or 18 fantasy points. No, not good for the 3rd overall pick, but that's what I envision to be the worst case scenario. I seriously think people are sleeping on him the way they did with Mobley entering last season. I'm not saying he'll be as immediately fantasy friendly as Mobley, but there's definitely a scenario where he averages 15 points, 8.5 rebounds, a couple of assists, and a steal and a block on 23 fantasy points. And that's as a rookie. I almost took Nurkic because, like I said, for James, it makes sense to bring in a veteran that supplies over 25 a game, but the way I see it is like this. I'd be less upset with myself from passing up on a good year of Nurkic than passing up on a possible future stud in Jabari Smith. At number 11, I went with Kyle Kuzma, who I'm not totally sure about. Last season, he averaged 23 fantasy points, and if he mirrors that or manages to improve, then I'd be through the roof with this pick, and that's why I selected him. But my concern lies in the fact that the Wizards have a steep front court and forward rotation, and that Porzingis will take boards and shot attempts away from Kuz. I mean, it's really only a matter of time before Porzingis gets injured, but still, with their unclear rotation, he could fall all the way down to like 18 fantasy points, which would make me fucking vomit after passing up on other guys. Still, to add someone that, let's meet in the middle, will average like 20 fantasy points is a good addition to my loaded roster. My next pick, though, might be my favorite actually, because I'm really sold on Trey Jones. Maybe not for the future, because I don't really see him as an all-NBA level keeper, but I mean, if he is, that's fantastic. It's just that the Spurs are going to be disgustingly bad, and he will be the starting point guard with DeJounte Murray out of town. His numbers when he got the minutes were actually very impressive, and I'm hopeful he averages around 12 points, 7 assists, and 22 fantasy points on the year. At number 35, I selected Cole Anthony, and I'm pissed because, again, I should have taken Terry Eason here. Nonetheless, I'm a little mixed on this pick too, but I definitely feel like people are giving Cole Anthony a bad rap. He may not be a future all-star, and I know there's concerns with the backcourt players surrounding him taking his value away, but there's a lot of people that don't seem to remember there was a 2-month stretch last season where he averaged 24 fantasy points per game. Secondly, in 2 seasons alone, he's already proven to be the better fantasy player than Markelle Fultz has ever been, and Jalen Suggs was obviously terrible too. Now, Fultz is once again injured for however long, and Suggs also just got recently diagnosed with some shit too. I understand if all these guys are healthy and playing, Cole probably doesn't eclipse 16 fantasy points, and the arrival of Banchero as well as the other guys who want the ball doesn't bode well for him either, but with Suggs and Fultz out of the lineup, I don't see why he can't average 19 to 20 fantasy points, which I'll definitely take in the 4th round. Hey, it's also only about to be his 3rd season, so there's still a shitload of potential to unlock too. I understand the criticism, and I may have to drop him in 2 months, but if he can help me stack up wins to start the season, I'm not gonna complain. Last up with the final pick of the draft, I had to go with the 2nd overall pick from 2 years ago in Gordon Hayward. Isn't that nuts? In just 2 seasons, he fell 48 spots and wouldn't have even been drafted if it wasn't for me. Now, I get it, this guy can't stay healthy. At best, he's going to play 60 games, but that's probably even too generous. But for the final pick in the draft, a guy that when in rhythm averages 21 fantasy points and will have the ability to produce a lot more stats with Miles Bridges out of the picture, as a contender, I'll take that risk every fucking time. If he's bad or can't stay healthy, I just drop him. It's not a big deal. It was the 50th pick. How many 5th rounders pan out anyway? This is a proven veteran when healthy, and I understand that health is never really there, but based on all the shit I just said, it makes perfect sense. So yeah, I'm pretty much going to be in the running for all the major awards again and should be penciled in for at least 14 wins. The league is more competitive and challenging than it's ever been, but the Knights haven't shown any signs of slowing down from a roster perspective, manager presence, and everything in between. There's a chance my draft doesn't assist me as much as I'd like, but that's a minor gripe and an otherwise delectable start to the season. I've got a greater variety of competition this year, but I have no reason not to believe in myself as a GM, as the reigning MVP and champion, and with the moves I made this season already, expect the Knights to be on the brink of a repeat. But of course, we're not done. It's time to get into the award predictions, and we'll start off with the conference titles since they've already been made clear. Joe for the East and James for the West. I do think Cam could sneak up into the conversation on the East, and I'll shout out CJ and Gary for the West just because it's such a tough conference to predict this season, but I'd be amazed if James didn't capture his 3rd conference title. Now on to the most improved. I think it goes without saying that this award belongs to Gary this year. He literally didn't win a game last season. 1 win is an improvement, and he's one of the few teams in the offseason that actually made their team better too. Unless he manages to finish with less than 6 wins, I don't see how he isn't walking away as the most improved with the additions of Joel Embiid and Jaylen Brown to his roster. There's an argument to be made for Ish and maybe even past winner Gio to have a chance, but Gary seems like the best bet, hands down. Best draft. There were a lot of sneakily good drafts this year, and this is the toughest award to predict at the start of the year because so much changes, but I think I'm honestly going to go with Gary. You can't fail to mention Cam because he once again had himself a good draft that saw him choose Chet, Des Bane, Kevin Porter Jr., PJ Washington, and Nick Claxton, but Gary had 8 picks, so even if he had to drop 3 players, that helps in winning the draft, and most of these picks were really good. Paolo, Jamal Murray, Bobby Portis, Tobias Harris, and Brandon Clark will be contributors on all their respective teams. Benedict Mathurin has the chance to be all-rookie first team as well, and Mikal Bridges may ascend further, and Bones Highland might even enter the most improved player or 6th man of the year conversation. This was a really good draft that even if it had some mild misses, they're not taking away from what was done right. But at the same time, CJ is easily a close second for me because having no lottery picks and getting Jalen Smith, Franz Wagner, Terry Eason, and Jared Vanderbilt is really, really good. For Trader of the Year, there's always so many angles and avenues to take this award. You can look at how a team has positioned themselves for the future, the talent they got back, what they had to give up to obtain something, and the whole 9 yards. Since I feel like I did literally all of that already, it's hard not to choose myself. I'm a 2-time winner of the award, and I managed to get a pretty great player like Chris Paul to add to my keepers in addition to an abundance of draft compensation, including Ant's 2023 first, which looks primed to be next year's first overall pick.
Victor Wembanyama on the Knights. Tell him this. Giddy Smith. Victor Wembanyama on the Knights yet.
Gary got Embiid and a few other talented players as well, but I know that I never stop trying to trade and continuously make good swaps until the deadline every year. Cam always has to be mentioned with this award as well, and I'll name drop Josh because he's always completing trades even if they don't become a fantastic move in hindsight. Gio also got KD, which is amazing, but we're not talking about the trade of the year, we're talking about the trader of the year, and Gio also swapped a future first rounder for the 15th pick in the draft. I'd love to see him accept more offers this season, but either way, I think I'm going back to back. All dumbass is always tough because I basically have to call 3 people idiots, and before the season even starts too, so I'm prematurely saying 3 of you are stupid without even giving you a chance, but unfortunately that's just how the prediction works. For the first spot, I have to go with Ant. I'm sorry bro, but it's looking like you're going to finish in 10th, which always helps the all dumbass case. On top of that, you did keep Andrew Wiggins, which I personally feel is a really bad decision, and you also gave away Tyler Hero for nothing when I feel like you should have kept him anyway. I thought you were rebuilding, but it seems as if you've neglected to ride that out, and you're attempting to make it in the playoff race, which really isn't a good idea. Next will have to be Sam, who would be making his 3rd consecutive all-dumbass team. Since I have him in 9th, and a large reason for that ranking is because of his history that tells us he will lose winnable games by not setting his lineup, then I feel it's warranted. I mean, that was why Sam made all-dumbass the past 2 years. In addition, he made no off-season trades to improve his core or to get something for guys he was no longer holding on to. Trades aren't the end-all be-all of fantasy, but not making trades in the off-season when it could have benefited him in some way will probably factor into another all-dumbass campaign. And lastly, as of right now, I have to personally go with Gio. I considered Ish and even James, but Gio's draft was another blunder that will handicap his chances of competing for a title. The trade he made for the 15th pick will prove to be a disaster if Tyler Hero doesn't pan out, and I'm not really sure about the keeps of Draymond Green and RJ Barrett. As for now, this is more of a vote by committee because anything can happen through the year, but I'm mostly confident in these selections. That brings us to Dumbass of the Year, which has to be one of the 3 I just predicted, so my guess is gonna be Sam. It's between Ant and Sam right now, and while I don't like a lot of the decisions made by the Gems front office, at least I can count on Anthony to constantly try and put in effort. Sam should have made trades to better his team in the offseason or to get future picks for who he wasn't keeping, and he also had a below average draft in my opinion as well. We can guarantee he'll lose a few games from not sending his lineup, and I think he's locked into a Lowry finish, which will help his case too. For GM of the Year, I feel like people don't want to see me win again, although I'd say I'm probably still the favorite to take home my 3rd. However, I'm going to go with Cam. Assuming he's the top 3 seed and everything goes right, Sengun pans out, he makes more trades to increase his chances at a title, I think people want to see Cam with that trophy next year, and it could be very well deserving. I do believe that up to this point in the very, very young season, I've out-GM'd everyone else, but I'll give Cam the GM of the Year prediction due to voter fatigue and just the fact that he's more than worthy. All fantasy is always a fun one, mostly because I haven't missed a team yet, and that makes me feel really good about myself. So once again, I'm going to predict myself for a 4th consecutive selection. Then I will go Cam for all the GM of the Year stuff I just said, plus he's hot off his first selection. And lastly, this is another tough final pick, but I'm going to stay pretty predictable and go with James. James probably deserves it because he's going to be the best in the West according to my calculations, and he's got a great team. I didn't even really consider anyone else because I think it'll be near impossible to outduel these 3 ball clubs, but James does have his flaws as I talked about earlier. Still, it's hard to bet against a team that has Harden, Lillard, Bam, Beal, and a plethora of others, so I've got Joe, Cam, and James. Then finally, of course, we have the MVP. And while anything could happen which makes the league so fun, I think I'm going to repeat if the season goes the way I've analyzed it. I've made great trades, I had a decent draft, you know I'm going to stay active on the wire and battle my ass off every week. If the record shows that, it'll be hard for me to not win. I'd give a shout out to Cam as the runner-up and a dark horse pick in Gary, just because if he has momentum that brings him to at least 11 wins, people would love to give him his flowers for that amazing turnaround. But ultimately, I think it's my hardware to take home. And just like that, the predictions are complete. Once again, I can't wait to return to this at the end of the season and even mid-year to see what I predicted correctly, and even more so what I was vehemently wrong about. It's going to be another awesome season, and thank you all for being a part of the DBL.